Hey, everybody. I'm Jesse,
Hi, I'm Sam from the Danger Planet.
and this is Boring Conversation.
Welcome to Boring Conversation, a Malifaux podcast.
And welcome back to Boring Conversation, everybody. Today, as you have heard, I am being joined by Sam from the Danger Planet, and it's pretty revolting that it's taken us this long to get together for a podcast episode on this feed, Sam. So
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah,
We
I
keep talking
thought I had
about
done it. I was sure I had done it at some point, but it's great to be
Yeah.
here, Jesse. You were, one of my oldest Malifaux opponents in terms of, when I started playing the game again, and it is great to finally get a chance to talk Bayou with you.
Heck yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny. We've been talking about doing this for quite some time. And then, for one reason or another, schedules just didn't line up, or the pod recording focuses, changed a little bit here or there. I started trying to plug in some episodes that you and I hadn't really talked about collaborating on. But I figured, we just finished up the Nova Open. I ended up playing Bayou there the whole time, and I played quite a bit of Mah Tucket and the Tricksy keyword. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. But before we really get into that, let's kind of share what we have going on. I know that kind of the big thing coming up for me is going to be Captaincon. The events actually just got approved by the Captaincon team, so they are officially live on the event site. Now that is done, I'm going to start sending out invites for the MCCI, or the Malifaux Content Creators Invitational. So just be prepared to start hearing incessantly from me about that stupid event and the open tournament that I'm going to be hosting at Captaincon as well. You're going to hear it basically on every single podcast, on any guest podcast appearances or other content channels that I do. Plus, I'm going to be posting it on the Facebook and on the Discord and blah, 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 blah. So basically, by about December, you're going to be super sick of hearing about it, and you're going to have an entire further month to tolerate that before the event actually takes place. You'd think that being a good TO and a good content creator, I would have actually looked up what the dates are before I started recording, but I didn't. So I'm doing that right now. 2 seconds, y'all, while the website pulls up. So Captaincon is going to take place from February 4th, February 2nd to February 4th of 2024. It's going to be held in Warwick, Rhode Island, at the same venue that it was last year. Thanks, everybody, for attending then, and I truly hope to see all of you coming up very soon. There's going to be more information on the events posted very, very shortly. The kind of elevator pitch for the MCCI is that it is a 1-day, 2-person team event held on the Friday of the convention, open to any Malifaux content creation channels. You can send more than one team if you've got a lot of people that would like to attend. I know that Danger Planet participated last year, and I certainly hope to see you there this year. Sam, I assume that's probably part of the plan, yes?
Yeah, so that's actually my next big event as well, is Captaincon. The real, Sam heads, like, real deep in the lore, know that my wife just had a kid recently, and so I haven't really been doing nearly as much Malifaux as formerly, but next February is going to be almost a year old, and he's going to be a little bit more, not requiring constant two-parent attention 24/7, and so I will be at Captaincon representing Danger Planet and Goonhammer. I'm a
Yes,
double
and
threat.
hopefully still married when you return. So
Well,
we shall
that's the
see
plan.
how that goes. Yes. So I know that last year, I think we had a total of, it was either 10 or 12 teams that participated. I can't remember the exact number. I'm hoping to hit the 14 team cap this year. And just because of the way that team pairings and scoring actually works, it's possible that we could probably exceed the 14 team cap and still be able to finish as a 3-round event, which is obviously the goal. And then anybody who participates in the MCCI is welcome to participate in the open event, which is going to be Saturday and Sunday, 2 days, 5 rounds. And it's always a fantastic time. I'm really hoping to exceed the previous record of 38 players. This year, I'm really hoping for over 40. And with the health of the community, I think that we are in a good spot to accomplish that. So, with that said, that's really what I have going on aside from attending the Lone Star Fodown in Houston. That's going to be October 14th to 16th, as I recall. I'm actually going to be flying in. Actually, you know what? I think it is the 13th to 16th because there's some Friday events as well. I'm going to be flying in on Thursday the 12th, which happens to be my birthday. How about that? And I would love to get some casual games in Thursday evening and Friday before the official events kick off on Friday afternoon. So if anybody is going to be there in attendance and wants to get a game in, just let me know. And I still don't know which faction I'm bringing. Go me. I have less than a month to figure that out at this point. So Sam, any other plugs or goings on with the Danger Planet crew that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I don't have an event plug, but I will say that Weird, who we are all huge fans of, has, as you at the time of recording, as you may know, just launched their Kickstarter for the Vagrant Song expansions, Encore and Off the Rails, which they were kind enough to give Danger Planet a preview copy of, and we shot a really cool promotional video. You can check that out on our channel on YouTube, Danger Planet, and the game is awesome. I don't know how many viewers have played Vagrant Song. It is very cool. It is one of my favorite board games, and it is this extremely high quality, lovingly designed, like high production values game. And so, when I heard they were getting an expansion, or not even just an expansion, but 2 expansions, I was like, I immediately need to back this because I need these expansions the day they come out. And I'm not the only person who thought so. The Kickstarter more than doubled its goal on the first day, and as I'm recording this, which is I think the 6th day of the Kickstarter or the 5th day of the Kickstarter, it's like I think quadruple its goal. So they're just really doing a great work, and I'd strongly recommend everyone who likes Vagrant Song go back that right now. And if you don't know much about Vagrant Song, but hearing me talk it up has got you intrigued, go to our YouTube channel, Danger Planet, and check out our video promoting it. And while you're there, you can see our other videos as well. We have a lot of Malifaux content, and it's great.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say that I've actually never played Vagrant Song, so that's one of the things I'm really hoping to do when we go to Houston, especially where there's going to be some spare time. I'm almost positive that there's going to be a copy of it there, so I'd love to get my hands on it for the first time. It's as a true lover of board games, but with some younger kids that do make it a little trickier to get out for regular board game sessions. It's really appealing to me because I really like kind of one of the pitches for it, which is 5-minute setup, 5-minute breakdown, and a relatively quick game time. From what I understand, you could easily get maybe 1 or 2 games in within a game session. And then because the setup and breakdown time is so quick, it's not like some of these other gigantic, expansive, like dungeon crawler style board games that I love, where they're super fun, but they take 45 minutes to break all the pieces out, set up, and give people reminders on how to play because you only do it once every so often. The quick setup and breakdown and quick play time sounds just fantastic to me. Has that been your experience, Sam?
I think 5-minute breakdown and setup is like a little optimistic, but it's not that long, especially once you are familiar with it. So the game is basically, it's episodic. It's played in a series of missions, each of which is unique. And so there's like a playbook that tells you how to set up each mission. I think that a full campaign is 25 missions. And so as you go through, you're going to get a lot quicker setting it up. But the setup is quick. It's not anywhere. It's like, I'd say 10 minutes probably to set up and breakdown. And the game itself is probably about an hour. One of the things that I really like about it is that the first 2 scenarios really are basically a tutorial. And so they're very simple scenarios. So you're progressing through the campaign. You're taking, you're moving forward, but you are learning how to play at the same time. You don't need to have like a sort of a pregame practice session. You can just open the first session and start it right off the bat and by the time you finish it, you'll have a pretty good sense of the basics of the game, and by the time you finish the second session, you will be basically ready for everything else.
Yeah, and I really love just like the design aesthetic of the game. I know it's been talked about in 1,000 places, but it's got that kind of like classic Americana theme, which I'm a huge fan of games like, the BioShock series, which kind of pull from sort of the same era. So I mean, it's just like right up my alley. I'm really really looking forward to digging into it, and I'm almost positive I'm going to end up backing this Kickstarter because I'm sure they have a pledge level that lets you get the base game in addition to the expansions. So
they do.
Yep, good odds that I was actually thinking about it as I was in the shower this morning because I was listening to the Third Floor Wars interview with Kyle talking about it, and I'm like, I keep almost pulling the trigger. I think now's the time that I really need to do it. So there's a good chance that after this recording, I end up backing, and then it's in my home as soon as the project completes, which is just exciting.
And I've got a copy, so if you ever want to play, we can set up some time.
Fantabulous. So this is very kind of a long intro talking about stuff that is other than the episode topics, but before we actually do get into that, we have to share what we're drinking, and I'm going to preface that by saying this is a very unusual recording time for the Boring Conversation team. Generally speaking, we record in the evenings around 8:30, 9 o'clock. But Sam having some young kids and us having some other obligations that needed attending to, we're actually recording this at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So I am indeed not drinking alcohol. Today, I have a Chobani Complete little yogurt, like Greek yogurt smoothie drink, coffee and cream flavored, because I did not have breakfast. And by the time we're done with this, I'm going to be starving. And then I'm going to be chasing that with a cold brew coffee. Sam, what do you have today?
Well, Jesse, I'm drinking some of Nature's Own fine, clear, pure, precious, nutritious, cold H2O. That's right, water. And for me, the big challenge is going to be not drinking the paint water because I am also painting as we talk.
Yes. Absolutely. And then the second challenge is going to be not just downing the entire thing of water so that you have to take a pee break probably more than once before the end of this recording. So we'll see how successful we are in that regard.
Well, I've got that one solved. No spoilers, but if you know how astronauts do it, I'm all set.
Sam, that's a level of dedication that I truly respect. And, I'm sure the listeners are going to appreciate that too. Fantastic. Anyways, what are we talking about? Well, we mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, but we're doing a Tricksy deep dive, a long overdue Tricksy deep dive. I don't really do that many deep dive episodes, mostly because there's a lot of other pod channels out there that do them, and I just want to make sure that it's something that I feel like I can contribute to meaningfully. Mah Tucket and the Tricksy keyword is probably the one I've played the most of in all of Malifaux, and Sam has played a whole heck of a lot of that keyword as well. I think that between the two of us, we kind of are going to do a pretty good job of breaking down what the keyword models are, and how Tricksy really actually plays on the table. Very much like the Misaki deep dive that I did with Landon fairly recently, we're going to be going over broad brush strokes for how the keyword works, its overall strengths and weaknesses, and we are going to be doing maybe not exhaustive, but certainly touching on every keyword model, plus some notable out of keywords and a few other things that might augment the way that the crew plays pretty well. We're also towards the end going to be going over usability for like second master type crews, both with potentially Mah Tucket as a second master or other second masters hired into Mah Tucket. And then we're at the very end, we're going to be going over some of the new models that have been teased in the weird newsletter just a couple of weeks ago, Jebediah and the Haberdashers, and how we think they will fit into the keyword and Bayou overall. So, Sam, I was hoping before we talk about mechanics that you could kind of fill us in with what Mah Tucket's place in the Bayou and the larger world of Malifaux is. You're the lore guy, so take it away.
Sure. So, as you know, or as you may know, The Bayou is mostly run on families. You know, you got your Joneses like Summerteeth. You've got the Jebsons who show up in a few different places. You get and the Tuckets. And so Mah Tucket is, I guess, the easiest way to think of her is she's sort of Summerteeth Jones's chief rival, his bête noire, as it were. And she is, a matriarch rather than a patriarch. And her clan is unusual among gremlins in that they are thinking gremlins. They kind of use their brains. So she got her start robbing guild gold and soulstone couriers. There's a really, really excellent piece of fiction in the second edition. One of the books, I don't remember which one it's in, but it's Mah Tucket totally outsmarting some mercenary that the governor general has hired to guard the gold convoys. But her and her bushwhackers and Tricksy Bell, who's kind of her second in command, are bandits. Basically, they ambush, they use tricks and traps and sneak attacks. And in third edition, she has become kind of fascinated with human high technology, which is something that all gremlins kind of like to a certain extent. I mean, you can see Zip, and he's got his fascination with the airship. But she took this to kind of its ultimate extension when she launched a raid on the Hollow Marsh pumping station, which was a pumping station that the Arcanists put together. That was basically Victor Ramos's secret base that had a lot of his inventions and designs in it. And so she made off with a bunch of Victor Ramos contraptions, which she used to make herself an amazing mecharachnid, which we'll discuss when we get to title Mah. But that's sort of the thing. That's her thing. That's what she's all about. She's a very smart, very clever, tricky gremlin raider who basically just likes to rob humans of anything shiny or valuable.
And one of the really cool things about this keyword is it kind of plays into the gremlin themes of like the female gremlins being the smart ones and the male gremlins, generally speaking, with a couple of exceptions within the Tricksy keyword, being the kind of dumb, fly off the handle, drunken, brutes. Mah Tucket, the little lass, her totem, and several of the other keyword models are all female gremlins, which you don't really see that much amongst the rest of the faction. There's a couple of minions here and there that might be, but we've got a couple of named models plus her bushwhacker support minions. And all of those models, for the most part, play kind of brainy. I mean, they're setting traps. They're tricking opponents into falling into them. They're being stealthy and just tricksy, just like the keyword. Mah Tucket is a really interesting character who I think has a pretty good handle on the Bayou political situation. And to your point, she's kind of, Summer's chief rival. I guess, we'll see how the democracy or the democracy, however you want to pronounce it, plays out. She did end up voting for Lenny to be the big boss gremlin. And I think it was probably just to keep Summer out of that seat. So.
Yeah, and I think she also thought it was funny to make Lenny the leader of all the gremlins, which, to be fair, she is correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that I've stumbled over a couple of lore things after Sam so artistically pulled everything together for us, let's talk about how the models play, because I can actually speak to that. So to start things off, I kind of pulled together a few sort of just key mechanics that tie the whole keyword together. The ones that really stand out are going to be really the only keyword rule that falls on almost every single model in the Tricksy keyword, and that is scamper. So scamper is a pretty incredible rule that, if you haven't experienced it or used it appropriately, doesn't really sound that impressive. For anybody that's not familiar with it, it reads as: after an enemy model within 6 inches, 6-inch aura of the model with this rule cheats fate, this model may push up to 2 inches in any direction after resolving the current action or ability. So bear in mind that this is not an enemy model being affected by the scamper aura. It is the model with the scamper aura being affected by an enemy model cheating. So if one enemy model that's within a 6-inch aura of 3 or 4 or 5 different Tricksy models that have scamper cheats, all of those models get to scamper, which is pretty chaotic, and it puts your opponent into some pretty difficult situations. I know that for me, there have been an innumerable number of situations when my opponent has considered cheating something that I don't want them to cheat because they're going to hit Mah Tucket, or they're going to just do something that's going to, push their game plan forward. And just by me saying, don't forget that's going to give me a scamper, sometimes they'll pull that cheat back, and it actually puts me in a better position. Frequently, when a scamper really wouldn't do much of anything. There have been times that, I would say, okay, well, don't forget, if you cheat that, it's going to let 3 of my models scamper, and they'll just pull it back, even though I don't really stand to benefit anything from those models moving at all. Sam, I'm sure that your experience with that ability is kind of mirrors my own, but do you have any thoughts on it before we move on?
Yeah, Scamper is an outrageously powerful keyword ability. And I would say that there's kind of 2 categories of use case for Scamper. One is the very straightforward, basically countering melee threats, right? Where if, like, for example, if somebody charges you and they have onslaught, this is like Hinamatsu, for example. Hinamatsu charges your model, carves into it with a 2/3/4, gets that onslaught trigger, but you cheat a high card to force Hinamatsu to cheat and hit you. They don't, she doesn't get her onslaught, she doesn't get flurry, she doesn't get her second attack. She just makes one sword attack, and then she sits there feeling like an idiot because you're gone. So that's sort of the first category of Scamper, is just very, very cleanly and plainly shutting down melee threats. It's really strong. But the other category is, as you say, kind of punishing people for cheating generally. And what I think is really interesting about this ability is that as you become more skilled in Malifaux, as you go kind of ascend through your improvement as a player, on the one hand, you get better at using Scamper because that kind of micro positioning is a very skill intensive aspect of the game. But on the other hand, it becomes in some ways less relevant because the more skilled you are, the more likely you are to have positioned your models correctly the first time and not to want to Scamper because the model is where it's supposed to be. So I think that the more skilled you get and more experience you get with the crew, you find yourself using Scamper in different ways, and that's one of the things I really like about it. Is it's an ability that's very lenticular, like it changes in its meaning based on time. So it's a great ability. It's really, really strong. Your opponent always has to think about it, and the fact that it's a 6-inch aura is enormous because that means that a lot of the time cheating doesn't just cause the model that they're currently focusing on to scamper, but it'll cause a bunch of your unrelated other models to scamper. And you can do things like set up charge lanes or scooch out of 6 inches for models with stealth, and just you can do a lot of little things. So it's a great ability. I could talk a whole episode on it. I'm not gonna, but in general, I'd say when you're playing Mah Tucket, you should always remember who has scamper, because really the only way you can misuse scamper is forgetting your models have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally always going to be relevant. And to Sam's point, it's either relevant because it corrects a positioning issue for your crew, or it forces your opponent into decisions that oftentimes are going to be, in some cases, like no win. It also really, really, really works well with some of the injured synergies that the keyword brings with one of the next things that we'll talk about, which is pit traps, because more often than not, once you get some injured on somebody and you're taking a swing on them, they're going to end up having to cheat first, which is going to give you your scamper pushes and still give you the opportunity to cheat afterwards and succeed in the attack action that you're making. Which is a pretty big deal. This is not something that only happens during enemy models activations. It's literally anything, and it's not even duels. It's literally anything that they cheat. It could be a heel flip. It could be a simple duel just to try and hit a TN. It could be an opposed duel where it could be an opposed duel. It could be literally anything that they cheat fate for. One common mistake with newer players is that they assume that when you cheat the initiative that it's your leader cheating, so they get to do scampers. That is absolutely not the case. That's pretty much one of the only cheats that doesn't get affected by the scamper rule. The other thing that Sam kind of touched on a little bit is that scamper is a ability that grows with you. when you're a newer player or just getting used to using the keyword, Scamper really lets you kind of band-aid a lot of the small micro positioning mistakes that you're going to make when you're doing the unpack. And quite frankly, that even happens with experienced players too. I know I goof stuff up all the time. I'm like, oh geez, I forgot I'm outside of 4 inches of this one critical spot. Or you know what? I'm like a half an inch away from this guard the stash marker. That's okay. I don't need to spend an AP using a horrible Hollerin with Mah or the little lass or some other movement trick to get my model closer. I can just assume that before the end of the turn, something within 6 inches is going to cheat, and then they're going to be able to push into range. So it lets you fix all those micro positioning mistakes, and then as you get more experienced, it lets you keep your models alive. It lets you do all number of other things that your opponent doesn't want to see. So yes, on the surface, Scamper looks kind of okay. In practice, especially with some experience, it is, as Sam put, outrageously strong.
And you've touched on something that I think is an important sort of aspect of the crew, which is that Tricksy is a very high skill cap crew. You can really redline it and do a lot of crazy things the more experience you have. But it's also, in some ways, it's a very forgiving crew, because one of the easiest types of mistakes you can make in Malifaux is a positioning error, like, just screwing up your positioning of a model. And there are a lot of ways in Tricksy to correct positioning errors via Scamper, via Horrible Hollerin, via a few other things. So it really is a crew that allows you to it has the tools to kind of dig yourself out of a bad situation. So I think it's a crew that I would not recommend, like, oh, don't play Tricksy if you're getting started. It's too complicated. Like, yes, it's complicated, but it also has some very new player friendly tools.
Yeah, and actually what Sam just said kind of dovetails right into one of the next key mechanics. One thing that's worth noting is that in terms of actual keyword mechanics, meaning shared unique triggers, shared front of card abilities, this crew actually doesn't have that many that kind of span the entire keyword. Scamper's pretty much the only thing. And there's like 1 or 2 models in keyword that don't have that. Those are primarily going to be some, cross faction model here or there. But that's it. There's no, it's not like some others that share 2 or 3 front of card abilities or have like a unique trigger like Damien's crew with things like prioritize, where there's multiple models that have that. Scamper's pretty much the only thing. So in terms of key mechanics, I would say, just like Sam said, movement is really one of the key things that ties this whole crew together. It can be offensive movement, defensive movement, knocking your enemies around and putting them out of position, moving your models into more advantageous positions via things like Scamper, Horrible Hollerin, a number of other things that the crew can do. Some models that are extremely fast or have opportunity for out of action or out of activation movement. And I think that that's another one of the things that makes this a relatively forgiving keyword. You've got numerous models with either very high movement like Rooster Riders or the ability to bury and unbury like Soulstone Miners. You've got stuff like Survivors that have Magnetize that turns an otherwise relatively slow model with just move 5 into like all of a sudden something that can cross, a quarter of the table or a third of the table in one activation if you really need them to. The totem, for the most part, for the first turn or two is basically just a Horrible Hollerin bot where you're just moving the models that you didn't get quite far enough into the right spots. So movement, I think, is absolutely key. And quite frankly, movement is probably one of the most powerful things in Malifaux. There's lots of ways for this crew to move that isn't a walk action. And as we all know, walk actions are pretty much the least efficient thing that you can do in the game. So any add-ons to that, Sam?
Yeah, so I think anybody who plays war games has probably heard some variant of this, but movement is one of the most important and powerful things you can do in a game, because movement is the only aspect of the game that is completely under your control as the player. Like, models in Malifaux move a set distance and they can move in any direction, and you, the player, have total control when you are declaring a movement or a push or whatever of how it goes. Everything else, you're at the mercy of the deck or your opponent's hand. So if when I say this is a high skill cap crew, one of the things I'm referring to is that it has a lot of weird movement tricks, and movement tricks are the place where player skill really shows an edge, because it's the aspect of the game that is the most under the player's control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that really appeals to me the most. And, Sam's mentioned it 2 times, but This is a very high skill cap crew. We're going to get into that when we do the next section with strengths and weaknesses, but it's one that I enjoy just as much now as when I first picked it up. It brings a lot to the table, both for newer players and for players that have 25, 30, 40 or more games of experience with this particular keyword. And to this day, I still feel like I learn new things every single time that I put it on the table. I find it very rewarding to play. Before we get on to the strengths and weaknesses, though, the only other thing that I was going to mention as a keyword mechanic, so to speak, is the utilization of pit traps. Both versions of Mah Tucket interact with or create pit traps in one way or another, and there are several other models in the keyword, in addition to the new teased models, Jebediah and the Haberdashers, that also can create or interact with pit traps. So, I mean, really, we've got Mah Tucket 1, Mah Tucket 2, the Bushwhackers, to a certain degree, the Soulstone Miners, although theirs is a little more corner case, and then these new models that can generate or interact with or ignore or what have you pit traps. I know that my personal play style with Mah Tucket tends to crutch on pit trap creation pretty heavily, but these things are essentially 50 millimeter, destructible, severe, hazardous damage 1, and most critically, I find injured 1 markers that you can, depending on the way you build your crew, absolutely flood the table with. They will absolutely rain on an opponent's parade if they're not prepared for the volume of them that you can put out, especially on tables with really tight movement lanes where they're going to have no choice but to either spend AP or use out of keyword, kind of tech picks to get rid of the pit traps, or have to walk through them. And that's like the last thing that you want to do. We're going to talk a whole heck of a lot more about these as we get further in the episode, but is there anything that you wanted to add on them before we move on, Sam?
Yeah, pit traps, in my opinion, even more than Scamper, are the defining mechanic of this crew. But pit traps are how the Tricksy crew does damage. GG3 is very much about being able to bully areas of the board, being able to control areas of the board, and the Tricksy keyword, as we're going to discuss, is very fragile. The way that it bullies the board is by making large areas of the board horrible to be in because they're full of pit traps. And it also, there's so many abilities in the crew that displace enemy models, and throwing somebody into a pit trap, in addition to being extremely funny, is really, 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 really strong. And we'll get to this, I think, in more detail. But just where I want to preface this is, when somebody is injured 1, all of your attacks are much more likely to hit them. When they're injured 2, your attacks are almost certain to hit them. When they're injured 3 or more, it's like, why are you bothering to flip cards? So there's this ability to really just like put somebody in a position where they have to put forward a Herculean effort or they're just gonna die.
Right.
And the other thing about injured that I really want to note is that it's a very snowbally mechanic, because once you start getting injured, it makes it much more likely that you will continue to get injured, because the attacks that inflict injured or attacks that push you into a pit trap are now more likely to hit you. So once you start getting injured, you are going to keep getting injured unless you immediately take evasive action and dedicate an activation to rescuing that model. So it's a mechanic that doesn't need a huge amount of kickstarting to be functional. And with the new guy, we're going to get to him at the end, you can get that train started without any interaction from your opponent whatsoever. So it's very strong. Pit traps are incredibly strong. And by the same token, kind of the flip side of it, if your opponent is playing a crew that really ignores pit traps, which I guess would basically be Urami or opposing Tricksy or Foundry crews, you need to radically reimagine what your list looks like, because a standard Mah Tucket list is highly dependent on pit traps to do damage in any significant way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things to really consider with the whole stacking injured thing is, let's say you are up against something that has a lot of damage mitigation. Those are the things that Bayou, generally speaking, has the most difficult time dealing with. Something like, Hoffman is kind of the gold standard. He's got a lot of armor too. He has access to shielded. He has access to healing. That is a crew that the Bayou faction as a whole, going all the way back to the launch of 3rd edition, has always kind of struggled with. Mah Tucket can deal with that crew by dealing a significant amount of ping or chip damage. And the most important thing there is that with the pit traps, the model gets the injured even if they don't take the damage. So if you're playing up against somebody that has some ability to reduce damage from hazardous to 0 with armor, like you're playing into a guild crew that takes, I think it's called riot gear, is one of the upgrades.
It's no prisoners.
No prisoners. That's what it is. No prisoners, and they get the riot gear bonus. Or if somebody's playing something that puts out an aura that lets you reduce damage from hazardous to 0 with armor. Or if something just has armor and shielded stacked up on each other, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to knock your peacekeeper that has shielded 3 around in this pit trap, and sure, I'm not going to deal damage to it with the pit trap itself, but I'm still going to put injured on you. So you do that a couple of times, and essentially what you're doing is, for this one big kind of anchor model that the entire enemy crew is based around supporting, you're turning all the rest of your crew's attacks up to 11. So the first injured is going to put your most of your models at stat 6. Then the second one puts them at stat 7, then 8, then 9, so on and so forth. And that's one of the major things that you use to evaluate new models is how many of the models in your crew can you guarantee will get their actions through. A lot of times, if you look at a model that has a stat 5 attack, you're like, I mean, that's not really that good. Like, I can't force critical attacks through with this thing. And more often with new models as they come out, especially in some of the more recent expansions, basically, if it wasn't stat 6 on its key ability, it might not even be worth really considering over some other stuff. There's a lot of stat 5 in this keyword. Basically, all of the support models are stat 5. Even Mah Tucket, one of her abilities is stat 5. And just the ability to stack up injured on enemy models totally changes the math on what is effective in the game. So that's something that we're going to be taking into account when we look at some of these models.
One more thing to think about with pit traps is we talked a lot about how powerful their hazardous is. They are also severe. Do not forget that they are also severe. If you can, especially because you, as the Tricksy player, are often putting people into pit traps, you can position them in the middle of the pit trap, and a 30 mil base in the middle of a pit trap is going to have a devil of a time getting out. Like a 30 mil with a 5-inch walk, which is a pretty standard combination of base size and walk stat for many models. It's going to take most of that walk to get just fully out of the pit trap. And that means, especially for models that with like a 0-inch engage, it's just really awful for them to do anything to you when they're in a pit trap. They basically have to spend their whole activation getting out of it, which usually means they just spend 1 activation to slam it and remove it, 1 AP. But then if you throw your opponent in a pit trap and they slam it to remove it, first of all, they do take the damage. Like if you're standing in a pit trap and you slam it, you take the damage and the injured. Second of all, you basically inflicted damage, injured, and slowed.
Yeah.
Because you just taxed their AP. So do not forget that they are severe. Especially if you can get a real thicket of them, you could just make your opponent totally unable to get to you.
Yeah, and because they're severe, there's only a couple of 2-inch engages that you have access to. There are a couple of models in keyword that have them. And there's some kind of out of keyword picks that you might consider. But putting a model into a pit trap and also, just outside that sort of like 1-inch range where most models can attack on a 2-inch engage model makes it so that if they even try to do something like a disengage, the chances of them actually making it out of your model's engagement or out of the pit trap are very, very, very slim. And it's not at all uncommon for you to be able to put, you can't overlap pit traps because of the way that, create rules work, but you can put them essentially in base contact with each other. And if it's very easy to get enemy models into 2 pit traps at once, and then they can't even slam to get rid of the ones that they're in because they're going to end up in the other, even after the first one gets removed. It's really, really crippling.
Yeah, it sucks to deal with.
Yeah. So it's funny because one of the sections that we had in the next segment for strengths and weaknesses was about pit traps, but we basically covered all of what makes them good right now. So we're just going to go ahead and skip that. We also talked a little bit about the mobility piece. We talked about that quite a bit in the movement and the scamper bit. So broad brush strokes, the strengths of the keyword, and we won't go into detail on all of these because, like I said, we've kind of touched on some of them already, are going to be the mobility, lots of action, lots of fast models and out of activation, movement, enemy ability to move your opponent's models. Pit traps can make life extremely difficult for opponents if they don't have a plan to deal with them. But other stuff that I wanted to bring up are there are a lot of models in this keyword that have high damage potential, and both versions of Mah Tucket can pulse out focus. It's a little trickier for Mah 2 to do it. Mah 1 can do it pretty easily, but Mah 2's focus pulse also has a larger area of effect. So, there's a little bit of a trade off there. Essentially, your ability to pulse out focus to multiple models in your crew can enable them to hit those moderates, or more often than not for this crew, severes is what you want to be doing for that high damage potential. They also have a very, very big hiring pool. There's multiple ways that you can build an effective Mah Tucket 1 or 2 crew. And there's so many different models out there that are options. It can actually be very difficult for your opponent to counterpick you. If you are playing into a queue or into a faction that has good access to marker removal or some of the other things that Mah struggles with, it's pretty easy for you to just change up the way that you build the crew to still be very effective and kind of zag away from those weaknesses that you might get counterattacked against.
It's an enormous pool. I think that I am more bearish on some of the models than I think the average Malifaux player is, and I'm gonna, we'll discuss it when we get to it. But there's still a lot of models in this pool that are viable hires. And I do think though that the one thing I'd say that you really can't build around is because both versions of this crew really want to have fun with pit traps. You are it's not impossible to win games against enemies that are immune to pit traps, but you're building uphill a certain amount. So that's the one thing I'd look out for, is that's when I'd really start going out of keyword, I think. Because when your opponent's immune to pit traps, a lot of models that are reasonable hires become less so.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I would mention is, and this kind of lends to that large hiring pool, this crew can outrange opponents better than I think just about any other crew in Malifaux. There are a ton of 14-inch guns that you can take, and those 14-inch guns are going to be on either very durable models like Survivors, extremely mobile models like Rooster Riders, or very difficult to get to grips with models like Bushwhackers, thanks to their stealth and a couple other things that the crew can bring to bear. So while most of these guns aren't super threatening on their own, just being able to outrange even most other ranged focused crews really kind of changes the math of engagements, and your opponent definitely has to take it into account when they're figuring out how they're going to do their turn one unpack. A lot of times your opponent has to actually spend extra time moving, especially on turn one, just to make sure that you can't shoot them while they are unable to shoot you back.
Yeah, and if your opponent is really relying on a key totem, especially your standard like defense 4 or 5, health 4 or 5 totem, we'll talk about it more when we got to specific models later on, but it warps the way that your opponent can even deploy. Because I had a game against Von Schill where I won the game on the first activation because I won initiative, I went first, I focused, I shot a steam trunk, I cheated in a 13 Rams for the force through a hit with crit strike, and I blew it up. And for the entire rest of the game, he did not have equipment. He had some equipment from Shill, but he had like an incredibly tiny, limited amount of equipment, because if you blow up the trunk before a significant amount of equipment goes out, Shill just doesn't get to do that much of it.
Yeah, never mind the fact that I think it actually blows up when you kill it. So
if
it
does actually blow
his
up
own models, it can damage them, which is pretty punishing.
It does. I mean, it just did a little bit, but yeah,
a little bit. I mean, anybody who's played any significant amount of Tricksy can probably speak to this. Is, if you see, you kind of always want your opponent to deploy first, and then if you're playing bushwhackers with From the Shadows, which we'll get to, it doesn't even really matter when they deploy. If you see a totem in a vulnerable position, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be able to kill it turn one, depending on how aggressive you want to be with your models. We'll get to that a little bit.
Yeah, and there's a lot of what I would call the dog totems, like Luna and Penelope, are actually like super key to how their crews function, and also super fragile. So blow them up.
Yep, true story. So, those are some of the strengths of the keyword. Are there any others that you wanted to call out before we move on to some weaknesses, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the biggest strength of the keyword, besides the stuff we've already talked about, is not just mobility tricks on your own models, but displacing enemy models. Like, I have a standard crew that I run, with Mah Tucket, that I don't always run it, but this is sort of my comfort food, we'll talk about it when we probably at the end we're talking about crews. But the point is, it's a 9-model crew, and all 9 models have at least one way to move enemy models.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are kind of conditional, but that's a lot of movement of enemy models, which is a really, really, really strong thing to do in this game. Partially because, in general, it's strong. It pushes people off of objectives and so on. But also because if you're pushing somebody into a pit trap, you just staple a point of damage and an injured and sort of an asterisk that says your next activation is going to completely suck onto the damage track of whatever ability you're using. So, yes, big strength of the crew is displacing enemies.
Yeah, the only other I totally agree. I mean, it's one of the things that I love the most about it. There's basically nothing else in Malifaux that gives me more joy than hitting mask triggers on Mah's attack and knocking people aside into pit traps. It makes me squeal in abject glee. It's delightful. It's not often that you can say that a knock aside trigger is the one that you want to hit more than just about anything else on a model. So yeah, that's really saying something. We'll get to that more when we talk about Mah 1. But yeah. Anyway, the other thing that I would make mention of before we move on is that there are several models in this keyword that have resource generation. I think that's one of the things that makes the crew so strong is, Mah Tucket 1 can generate a ton of resources in the form of cards, depending on how, your flips and stone usage go. You've got soulstone miners that can generate stones and either keep your crew fed with them as the game goes on, or allow you to start the game with a smaller than normal cache, and still be in the running. That's one thing that Mah Tucket in particular tends to be very, very stone hungry. So being able to generate those while still having a model on the table is a pretty big deal. There's a couple other models in the keyword that can use things like free loot bonus actions or a few other things here and there to generate some additional card draw. There's some surges available, as I recall, with some Mah 2 models and some more stone generation with the rock hopper and a few other things as well. So the resource generation piece is a big deal. And I think that is one of the things that can actually be a dividing line between very strong crews and just strong or average ones. And that's definitely something that this crew kind of hits the nose on. It doesn't generate the gross amount of card draw that some other crews like your Von Stucks and your, Tiri Nomads can. But it's still more than enough to keep them afloat, and it can actually swing the balance of the game significantly sometimes. So in terms of we've talked about all the stuff that makes the crew amazing. It does have some very significant weaknesses, though. Sam already talked about one of them, and that's how fragile some of the models can be. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that can kind of warp the game experience and really kind of punish newer players if they don't play it right?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest downside of the crew, which is just that your models are not hard to kill. I mean, the most durable model in the crew is probably Big Brain Bryn, which is not a good thing. Like that he is not he is not hard to kill. That is not a model that is famously durable. So even Mah Tucket herself, like Mah Tucket is the master that I lose more than any other master, and part of that is sort of what you do with her. Like if you're using her properly, you are reasonably likely to lose her because she's out doing stuff and putting herself in danger. But a lot of these models have some form of defensive tech that is usually some way of not getting hit. Once you do hit them, they crumble. And I think that is um, really just unavoidable. You can't build a durable Tricksy crew, and if you try, you're going to handicap yourself in other significant ways. But it's something you really need to be aware of, and you do have a lot of conditional defensive tech, but it needs to line up right. Like, for example, the ability to cancel triggers is kind of low key one of the most important pieces of defensive tech that the game has. Like if you've played Wong, he's so much tougher than he looks because you can't declare triggers into him. I think it's once you start seeing what it's like to cancel triggers, you actually start realizing how many of the game's most deadly models actually have a lot of that deadliness budgeted into their triggers. So
Yeah.
that's a really strong piece of defensive tech. It's also a 6-inch aura that costs you a card. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
like you have Wong's 3 Demon Bag. You have a 6-inch aura that costs you a card, but if you use it right, that can keep you alive. So that's
Yeah.
I'd say there is defensive tech, but it's conditional. The other thing that I would say is a weakness of the crew, and is the damage is also often very conditional. I mean, with the exception of
Mm-hmm.
Ma herself, most of your models are like 234, 235. Two of the models that I take the most often don't actually have a damage track on any of their abilities. Um, you are really relying on things like pit traps. You are relying on debilitating enemy models by making them slow and displacing them so that you can afford to take several activations to kill them because they're not doing anything in the meantime. Um, you are relying on the fact that you can deny scoring without killing enemy models. And these are things are all true. You can Trixie's a super strong keyword and wins a lot of games, so it's not like its damage, its lack of damage is crippling. But this is a real consideration that your models can do damage, but not super easily. And usually, if you want to get the maximum amount of damage out of them, you need to set things up. And as I've alluded to earlier, if your opponent is immune to pit traps, or if you are unable to get out a bunch of pit traps, your damage ceiling is pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, there's some models. There's a lot of models in the keyword. I think actually everything except for Mah Tucket 1 is min 2 or min 1. Min 1 is in many cases not that much different than min 2 until you're fighting somebody that has access to shielded or incorporeal, and then you're basically always hitting 0 damage, which is pretty miserable. All the min 2s really get punished by any kind of mitigation. We talk about bushwhackers, who, in my opinion, are one of the all-star models of the crew, but their base damage track is 235. So unless you're hitting that severe or hitting some triggers that are set up at the right time, you're probably not really doing that much damage. Mah Tucket has to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and sometimes she's gonna be not in a great spot. She can only affect a certain amount of the board at once. So if you're trying to deal with something off on a flank, here's to hoping you have the right cards or a plan to deal with them, because she might not be able to assist. The damage output of the crew is also really contingent, like I said, on hitting the right triggers. So rams are very, very, very valuable in this crew. The several models that have crit strike or other triggers on rams that can help enhance damage. So you only have so many of those, and you might get lucky and flip into them. But if you don't, if you're just taking random attacks with bushwhackers or rooster riders and you're not hitting the triggers that you need, you're probably not really doing that much.
All that said, injured stacking is one of the most degenerate gameplay loops
Yeah.
in this game, and Mah Tucket is probably the second best in the game at doing it. Maybe a little worse than Karis 1, but she just is a better master than Karis 1. So,
Yeah.
it's very hard for me to kind of describe it in a way that is inherently grokkable. You kind of have to see it, but when you do
Yeah.
see it, when you see what happens when you throw somebody into a pit trap and then do another movement ability on them while they're already in the pit trap, and then wait for them to activate and be in a pit trap already and have taken a bunch of damage and be double injured, and then they just the look on their face when they realize that there's basically nothing they can do to keep that model alive for the rest of the turn is
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, and going back to the whole trigger canceling thing in the strengths bit, you've got a model that can do that with Big Brain Bryn. He oftentimes is going to be around the same area that Mah Tucket is, and then you look at Mah Tucket's defenses and you're like, well, she's not that impressive. She's defense 6, willpower 5, move 5, size 2. No other defensive tech on her card whatsoever, aside from like maybe you can give her shielded 2 if you hit a crow on the initiative, which we'll get to. She's got Scamper, which you've already talked about is solid, and that's it. I mean, she's really hinging on putting your opponent into pit traps so that they have a difficult time actually hitting her back. She pretty much is always going to have 12 cups of coffee stapled to her so she can turn off bonus actions. And, you know, aside from that, you're like, well, I mean, what else can she do? But you take a look at an opposing, like, you know, initial release melee master like Tony Ironsides. Now, granted, Tony has her own, you know, issues being super competitive, but if you look at Tony's card in a vacuum versus Mah's card in a vacuum, you're like, there's no way that Mah Tucket's ever going to win this fight. She's going to get killed every single time, trivially easily, by Tony. I have never lost a game against Tony Ironside. She is always dead on turn 2. Because between putting her in pit traps, canceling all of her important triggers, and then just getting slowly beat down by Ma and the rest of the keyword models, like she kind of doesn't stand a chance. And you wouldn't see that if you, like I said, looked at those cards in a vacuum.
I'm going to add 2 brief caveats before we move entirely on from the durability conversation. And for the record, I've never lost a game to Tony Ironsides with Ma, but I've also never killed Tony. I don't even bother trying.
That's funny.
But the two caveats I'd add is, first, if your opponent is playing a melee crew specifically, and specifically a melee crew that doesn't have 2-inch engages or only has a few of them, your durability is a lot higher than it looks because you have Scamper, and Scamper is so strong against melee crews with a 1-inch engage. It's an outrageously strong piece of defensive tech. The other thing is that the most recent FAQ was massive for this crew because My Loyal Servant can heal the model it's targeting, which means Bryn, if you really need him to, can just spend his activation healing 2 different models and handing out focus to them. Or just handing out focus to one model and also healing that model twice, although you don't get 2 focus, you only get 1. Unless it's already got another condition on it, in which case you can have the 2 focus. So basically, I think that FAQ was massive for the survivability of this faction because it added a strong unconditional heal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess it's technically conditional because it's a trigger, but it's a trigger on a henchman who has intuition. So if you need it, you will get it.
Yeah, I mean, you can either stack the cards that you get from intuition, or worst case scenario, you know, cheat in a 6 ram.
Or stone,
or stone. Like it's not hard to do.
So that FAQ was massive for this crew's survivability.
Yeah, for sure. We'll get to that a little bit more when we get to Bryn's card. But the only other thing that I would make mention of, which is something we did talk about a little bit, and I do see both new and more experienced Mah Tucket players make this mistake very often. If you don't do your first turn correctly and you overextend, you can get utterly smashed, because if you're outside of your kind of bubble of defensive layers, or if you're the type of player that likes to just alpha strike Ma and be like, I'm going to put her in my opponent's face turn 1, she's not Nekama. She's not a peacekeeper. Aside from Scamper, she doesn't have anything that she can do. So if she's in the middle of your opponent's crew, they have a whole crew worth of models to beat her down with, and she will not survive. If you overextend this crew, you'll get punished hard, and you'll have a very difficult time winning most games.
Yeah, I don't want to say Ma is a glass cannon because that whole phrase doesn't make sense. Like, who would ever make a cannon out of glass? But like, you remember that guy who got imploded on the submarine trip recently?
Yes.
So his like great grandfather or great grandfather, some number of greats, was a naval officer who was in charge of during the presidency of, I think, Zachary Tyler. He was doing this exhibition of the ship, and part of it was the exhibition of this really enormous cannon that had been cast for the ship, and he had copied the design from a French cannon design. Except he didn't really understand why the French cannon was designed the way it was with these sort of reinforcing hoops. So he just decided to make the cannon thicker, which doesn't work because of the way transverse pressure from a detonation goes. So when they tried to fire the cannon to impress a bunch of visiting dignitaries, it exploded and killed a bunch of people. So that's the kind of cannon that Mah Tucket is. She's a real cannon. She's not made of glass. That doesn't make sense. Don't use that expression. But She is a cannon that blows up if subject to pressure.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it, and a nice little bit of historical info as well. I appreciate
I'm full of
that as much as
surprises.
man. Full of surprises. Also, I have to go back and say that I appreciate your use of lenticular in context before, because I'm an optician, so that just speaks right to my background. There you go. Anyway, on to the models. That gives us a good idea of kind of how the crew functions, how the models interact with each other. And next, we're going to get into basically every model in the keyword. And we won't go through every single thing on the card because, like, you guys can read. But there are definitely some models that we're going to talk about in more detail than others.
Wait, you can read?
I can, thankfully.
Since when?
I learned like 6 months ago.
Okay. Well, I'm behind now. Anyways,
okay,
we'll continue.
Yes. So I have the buckets of models. Bucket. See what I did there? Broken down into the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is models that are awesome, either all the time or most of the time. The bad is going to be mostly situational stuff. It's not actually bad. And then the ugly is stuff that is just not good, or is good in very kind of narrow circumstances. If you wanted to break it down to like kind of a tier list type thing, then we'd be really looking at like A and S being one tier, and that's the goods, bads being B tier, and then uglies being like C or like D tier. Really, we're going to go through each one of them though and talk about the things that really make them stand out, and interactions that they have with other models that really kind of tie the whole crew together. So with all that said, we're going to get right into the goods. Oh, you know what? There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, because sometimes you'll hear the phrase with regards to Mah Tucket and the Tricksy keyword, unbucket the tucket. I use that a lot. There is a little bit of history with that. It's not just a cute little turn of phrase. Because
I have never heard anyone say that.
You've never heard unbucket the tucket? Oh my god!
Never in my entire life.
So Mah Tucket has always been one of my favorite masters, going all the way back to when I started the game in 2nd edition. But Mah Tucket in 2nd edition was almost inarguably the worst master in the entire game. She was awful. Her crew was not good. Her rules stunk. She died to a stiff breeze. Like, you could try and use her and it just never panned out. And then the Broken Promises book, as I remember, introduced new what were called limited upgrades for all the masters in the game. Limited upgrades were like the equivalent of titles, but essentially what happened was you could only have one limited upgrade attached at a time. They would come with a soulstone cost, generally speaking, and they would enhance or change the way that your master worked. Titles, by and large, are a better piece of they're a better way to balance things, because one of the issues with the limited upgrades was that you always had to take into account all of the rules on the original card when creating this limited upgrade. So sometimes that kind of restricted the design space a little bit. That's why you don't see him anymore. Titles kind of took that spot. But in Broken Promises, Mah Tucket got a limited upgrade called Manifest Destiny, which I won't get into because it's another version of the game. But that single upgrade took her from being the absolute bottom of the barrel worst master in the game to like probably in the top 3.
It was such a band-aid. That upgrade,
incredible.
If you look at the text of it, it's so obviously just like, we don't feel like errating the base card, so we're just going to make an upgrade that you will always take. Right. It just was like an absolutely like unbelievable buff.
Yeah, they were like, oh, hey, this is actually the way that she was supposed to work all along, but we spent a couple of years not really touching her because we had more important things to do.
Like, you said that it was the equivalent of a title, but really, Manifest Destiny wasn't the equivalent of a title. It was the equivalent of an errata pass.
Yeah.
Like, that's if they were doing that in 3rd edition, they would have just done it as an errata pass.
Yeah. So that's where the phrase unbucket the tucket comes from, because she used to be absolutely abysmal, and then suddenly she was absolutely amazing. And there you go. So if you ever hear me or Pete from Rage Quit Wire, he says it a lot of times, say that, well, that's where it came from. Anyway, speaking of Mah Tucket, let's talk about Mah Tucket, the OG. So Mah herself, we've already talked about quite a lot. She drops pit traps. Any models that have the pit trap front of card ability, which are going to be Mah Tucket and the Bushwhackers. After deployment, you make a 50 mils pit trap marker anywhere on the table, not within 3 inches of the enemy deployment zone, and this model is unaffected by pit traps. She also has she is actually one of the first models in the game that had a leader only ability. Many of the masters from the launch version of 3E did not have leader onlys, but she has one called Careful Planning. If she is the crew's leader during the start phase, you gain one of the following effects as determined by the suit of the crew's initiative flip. So Rams let you get 2 pass tokens, Tomes let you draw 2 cards, Masks lets up to 2 friendly models move up to 3 inches, and Crows lets up to 2 friendly models gain shielded 2. So Careful Planning is probably the most important thing on the front of her card, in my opinion. Sam, what do you have to say about that ability?
I will never not think of it as chores.
Yeah, I still call it chores because that was another second edition thing. She did essentially the same thing in 2E, and chores is way more fun than Careful Planning.
Before we get too into specific abilities, I have something, just sort of a general philosophical comment on Mah, on her design, which is that a lot of masters in this game are kind of categorized mentally by people as sort of a beatstick master or a support master. Like, that's how people think of them. Mah Tucket is one of 3 masters in the entire game, counting titles, with a min 3 attack with crit strike. It is her, Lady Justice 1, and Victoria's 2. That's it. Now, I'm not saying that's like the only thing that makes someone a good beatstick. I mean, no one would say that Nekama isn't a good beatstick, but like that's a marker of sort of a design thing that they have not been willing to do that often. And by the same token, when someone's talking about a support master, they're usually talking about a master that does one or more of 3 things, right? They either generate resources, they have action or AP efficiency or AP transfer, and that includes like focus, pulsing, and stuff, or they have some kind of like aura or table-wide ability that modifies other models' rules. Mah Tucket does all 3. She generates cards, she generates pass tokens, she generates markers, she has a the chores ability to either move models around or give them shielded, is this sort of board wide aura type ability. She has a focus pulse, and she has the ability to move another friendly model, like basically spend an AP from Mah to take a walk action equivalent with another model. She falls into every category of master, and she does it all pretty well. So that's kind of what I think you need to keep in mind when you're playing her, is that she can do anything.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anything that you have the foresight to actually plan for, and have the ability to generate cards to, she can get done. And that's why I think the biggest reason that this is such a high skill cap crew is because she has so much flexibility and she's such a great generalist. She can really get pretty much anything done as long as you have the experience to make it happen. And there's very few other generalists that can hit min 5, to Sam's point. There's nothing like seeing your opponent's face just fall when you tell them, oh, I only hit min. That'll be 5, 4, whatever, and they just can't believe it. It's
the thing with Mah is that she's mostly a model that kind of like is out there kind of supporting. She's helping your models out, she's moving them around, she's pulsing out focus, she's disrupting, knocking people into pit traps. But sometimes she just like points at someone and does the like pointing at her eyes, pointing at your eyes thing, and then she charges out of engagement through terrain into you, smacks you in the face for a min 5, and kills you.
Yeah.
And there's
absolutely.
really not that much you can do about it, especially if you're already injured.
Yep. So one of the things on Careful Planning, there's really 2 things that kind of play into turn 1, which I think is very critical with Mah 1. Very rarely do I ever take any attacks with Mah Tucket 1 on turn 1, just using in the style that I play her. Most of the time she's going to activate, sometimes even like second or third, depending on what my crew build looks like. And really all she's going to do is pulse out some focus, move a model or 2 up the table, and get into a good position to be able to swing turn 2. A lot of times she's going to stay in a fairly conservative spot so that opponents can't get to her, and then I'm going to utilize the Little Lass's Horrible Hollerin' very, very late turn 1 to put her in a good position to just get a charge at the top of turn 2. And you can kind of feed that a little bit because, like we said, the careful planning, if you hit a ram, can generate 2 pass tokens. And like 9 times out of 10, in my opinion, that's what you want to be doing turn 1 with Mah Tucket. Is if you don't draw a ram of any sort, I mean, I don't care if I'm spending a 1 ram and I don't care if I lose initiative, or if I'm spending sometimes even a face card ram. I want to get those 2 pass tokens. Pass token generation is fairly rare. It's become sort of a hot button topic recently. And up until Yoko 2 came out, as far as I know, Mah Tucket 1 was the only model in the game that could generate first turn pass tokens. We saw that we still see that with Yoko 2. It's one of the things that makes her so strong. We also saw that with Harrison Frodsham. He got, adjusted so that wouldn't happen anymore because it was too powerful. And we see it with like Shoujo in the, Qiangong and Brewmaster keywords, but like that's pretty much it. Very, very strong.
Yeah, I also want to point out that it doesn't matter if you win or lose initiative if you cheat a ram, because if you cheat a ram and you get 2 pass tokens, even if you lose initiative, you can spend one of those pass tokens. It can be just like you won initiative and you still net 1 pass token.
Right. And oftentimes having access to those 2 pass tokens doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend them. I mean, there are certainly going to be, turn 1s, especially in distant deployments like corner, where that nobody's going to end up attacking each other. So you have the pass tokens, which makes your opponent have to worry about overextending because you could then come in with something at the end of the turn. So they play more conservatively, but then you just end up banking the 2 pass tokens for +2 initiative the next turn. And oh, by the way, Mah Tucket also has Ill Omens so that she gets +1 on her initiative flip.
I almost always make an attack turn 1 regardless of deployment, but that's because I'm an absolute fiend for bushwhackers.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, the fact that you can generate those 2 pass tokens plus you have the Ill Omens means that no matter what, you're going to get at least some kind of bonus to initiative on, turn 2, most critically turn 2 and turn 3. That's one of the things that I think really makes this crew very, very threatening, especially if you happen to take Tricksy Bell as well, who we'll get to in a minute, because she also has Ill Omens. There are times where, you're going to get +3 or +4 to the initiative if you haven't had to use your pass tokens. And at that point, your opponent is basically always going to go second, which means that Mah Tucket is always going to get to go first and beat something into the ground. Worst case scenario, let's say, oh, geez, man, I stoned for cards. I didn't get a ram. I don't have one in my hand to cheat for tomes, or my hand is kind of weak. I've already stoned for cards. It's still kind of weak. I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to cheat in this tome. I'm going to draw 2 cards at initiative time. Okay, great. Now my hand's a little bit better. So you're like, man, my hand still kind of stinks. What am I going to do? And then you're like, oh, I actually have good for a laugh on my bonus action. So I'm just going to cheat in a low tome or stone for a tome on turn 1, drop a pit trap behind my crew where I don't care about it. And, oh, hey, I've got 2 more cards that I've just drawn. Let's say my opponent actually gives me something that I can take a shooting attack against. She has Handful of Snakes, which is a ranged attack, only stat 5. But it also has good for a laugh. So like there are turns with Mah Tucket where you can have an absolute utter garbage hand that turns into a unbelievable hand that's stacked with severes because of the volume of card draw that you can get with her if you dedicate the resources and actions to do it. I've had opponents that have been absolutely stunned by the amount of card draw that Mah Tucket can generate. And then that really kind of skews their game plan for the rest of the turn because they just saw you stone for 2 cards, draw 2 cards off the initiative, and draw 2 to 4 more cards during Mah's activation. And they know that you have a strong hand at that point.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is remember that if you cheat the initiative flip, you're down a card in your hand. So when you draw 2 cards, you don't then discard 2, you discard 1.
Exactly. And there is kind of an interesting thing that happens with Ill Omens, meaning her getting +1 to the initiative flip and pass tokens. So let's say your opponent has a pass token or 2 because you've killed a bunch of their models. The pass tokens don't get factored into the initiative until after you've determined who has to cheat, but Ill Omens gets factored in first. So if your opponent has 2 pass tokens and you have Ill Omens 1 and you both flip 5s, your opponent has to cheat first, even though technically they would be winning the initiative flip if nobody were to cheat. So the timing of that is very important because it puts your opponent in some pretty undesirable situations. It doesn't happen all the time, but I can tell you it happens once at least every couple of games, and it's always very frustrating for opponents to deal with.
That's true. I will say that's a really stupid rule. Weird if you're listening. Like the whole pass tokens don't get calculated when determining who has to cheat initiative first is such a weird, unintuitive corner case that trips so many people up. And I don't think there's a lot of value added to the game by that being the case. That needs to change. That's just a silly rule.
Yeah, it ain't great. So other stuff that Mah Tucket has going for her, we already talked about it. She's got a 3/4/5 1-inch range stat 6 attack that has crit strike. So she can stone and cheat to get +2 damage. Pretty amazing. That can turn her already very threatening 3/4/5 track into as much as like 5, 6, 7. Crit strike is always good. We all know how good crit strike is. She also has severe injury, which just, kind of snowballs the whole injured generation thing that she has going on with the pit traps. And most importantly, in my opinion, she has knock aside. So I talked about this a little bit before. Knock aside is, generally speaking, kind of a situationally good trigger. Like on most models, it's the one that you are least interested in seeing. With Mah Tucket, it's arguably the most important trigger on her melee attack, because it's not just a 4-inch push in any direction, it's a 4-inch push into a pit trap while still being engaged with Mah, or knocking a model out of engagement, which frees Mah up to do other things. Again, also knocking him into a pit trap. So that pit trap turns her 3/4/5 into 3/4/5 +1 and injured 1. And that really can kind of get the injured snowball rolling. I probably stone or cheat for masks more than rams, which you wouldn't think would be the case, but that's certainly my experience.
Yeah, it's weird that knock aside is on her card almost strictly superior to severe injury, because in 99% of situations in the game that is not the case, but it is here. I mean, it's pretty rare to be in an engagement with Mah where there's not a convenient pit trap to throw somebody into, but they don't make themselves. You do have to make them. So it's rare that happens because you have so many opportunities to make it happen, but you do have to make it happen. Like, you need to be aware of where you're generating pit traps. And then another huge thing is you need to remember that Mah does not make pit traps while she's engaged.
Right.
So you really need to, if she's engaged, sometimes you're like, awesome, but if she's engaged and there's no pit traps nearby, sometimes you'll need to do something like either take your first attack with knock aside to push them out, so you can then dig a pit trap, which you can then charge over to knock them back into the pit trap.
Yeah.
Or you need to figure out how you're going to unengage yourself. If you're engaged by multiple models, for example, sometimes you will need to charge out, because you can charge while engaged. Charge out so you're only engaging one. Knock aside that one. Make a pit trap. Then use snakes and get the stone for the mass trigger on the snakes to push them into the pit trap so you can keep punching them. So you have options, but a lot of these options are, as Jesse has previously alluded to, very trigger heavy and therefore very costly in terms of stones or cards.
Yeah, I mean, there are situations that you can be in with Mah that are really not good at all. And, she's engaged by multiple models. Like Sam said, there's no pit traps around. There are things that you can do to have a very impactful activation with her, even if you're going to die. And you're like, if I just stay here and swing 3 times, I'll do some damage, but she's just going to end up getting killed. There's stuff you can do to play very defensively and cagey with her that also nets you a bunch of cards. So there have been times when I'm at, Mah's at 4 wounds, she's engaged with 2 models. I'm in trouble. Sometimes what you'll end up doing is exactly what Sam said. You charge out of engagement with most of them, so you're only engaging 1. You knock that 1 aside. Now you've got your bonus action and you've got 2 more AP. You make a pit trap right in front of yourself. You hit the tome for a good for a laugh. So you draw some cards to refill after the first attack that you just took. Then you have a model that's already injured because you knocked it into a pit trap, hopefully, or even if not, whatever. You take a handful of snakes attack. And now with that, you can either hit good for a laugh again while also dealing damage with blasts and poison to draw more cards, or if there are kind of a nest, like a web of pit traps around, the mass hysteria trigger on her handful of snakes is not like, again, mass hysteria is not normally like a super powerful trigger. But if you're going to hit like 2 or 3 models and push all of those models around inside pit traps and also give them damage and also give them poison, it's pretty gnarly. She can do an enormous amount of damage while in that specific situation also getting herself out of danger, because now there's a bunch of enemies that are inside pit traps and need to deal with trying to get out instead of swinging back on her.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I disagree with is that Mass Hysteria is not normally a powerful trigger. That trigger's sick.
It's sick. Yeah, it's exactly. I shouldn't say not a powerful trigger, but it kind of falls into the same bucket as Knock Aside, where, moving some models is often good, but not like game breaking. In this case, it can actually be game breaking.
Yeah, and I will say that moving multiple enemy models is more than twice as good as moving one enemy model.
It is
like,
it's absolutely true.
It's one of those situations where 2 is more than twice as big as 1.
Right. So anything else you wanted to add for Mah Tucket 1 before we move on? And in case you guys can't tell, we may be a little biased on our master title selection.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I'd say is just you are going to lose Mah if you're using her right, unless you're like really just blowing the game out. You're going to lose her turn 3, turn 4. That's fine. Just try to lose her after you've activated her on that turn. It means that Assassinate you will almost always give up both points on, which is it is a relevant consideration. I don't think it's not like I don't take her on Assassinate missions, but it gives me pause. And finally, the snakes. I think the snakes are the worst action on her card. That doesn't make it a bad action. I think that snakes, on average, people underuse. Like, more people should be declaring snakes actions than do. People don't want to because it is the worst action on her card and because her other AP are so strong, but it's a pretty good attack that has great triggers. Especially if you have sparks around to turn the scrap marker that it makes into a pit trap. It does a lot of really useful, powerful things, and it also means you can play a little cagier with Mah. You don't have to necessarily throw her into the own zone. You can kind of sit back and throw snakes at people for like 1 turn before you charge in. So just like think about it, right? Consider it.
Yep, absolutely. And then the last thing on her card that we haven't touched on, so we may as well, is she does of course have Horrible Hollerin'. This is the thing you're going to use primarily turn 1 to move a model or 2 up the board, and then you're going to hit the ram trigger for Creative Cussin to pulse out 3 inches of Focus 1. Pretty powerful. It does have the Purification trigger to end a condition. That is something that it corner case very, very good. You don't necessarily always want to be using your Master's AP to move a model 5 inches and end a condition on a tome. It's something that you frequently don't end up doing, and I probably don't do as much as I should. But it is an option if you remember that you have it. I can think of probably like 1 time that I've actually used the Purification trigger, and there's probably a lot more times than that I should have.
All right, so Horrible Hollerin' is an ability I will always use turn 1 because I want to get that focus pulse. I will use it on subsequent turns, but I'll never be super happy about doing so because it usually means I made a mistake and I'm now having to correct it, or my opponent has done something unexpected which I'm now having to react to, and I'd rather be proactive with this crew. But you will do it on subsequent turns. You may even focus pulse on subsequent turns, but it's less likely to catch like a large and useful number of models such that you would like proactively choose to do it. It's just like, if I have to holler in anyway, oh look, I can focus pulse.
Yeah.
But it's a good ability. I mean, it's a strong ability. It's an ability also that, again, the more skilled you get and the more experience you get with the crew, the less often you need to use it because the more often you get the positioning right the first time.
Right.
But it is very strong because it lets you correct errors.
And there are definitely some kind of corner case situations when it is absolutely the right pick. One important note is that, like, Mah Tucket is pretty mobile, but she is only move 5. She does have diving charge, but, again, only move 5. And she's only a 1 inch engage. So there's like this, it's basically like a 2 inch zone outside of her charge range where you can still touch something with a horrible Hollerin. And there have been many situations when, my hand is stacked because I have a lot of card draw. And I'm like, all right, well, I can just use one of these high cards because I have a lot to work with to holler an enemy model closer to me, maybe into a pit trap. That way I can then charge it with Mah instead of walk charging. And yeah, there's an opposed duel involved there, but it may also keep Mah in a safer position. Because a lot of times doing a walk and then a charge is going to put her in, punch back range with multiple models. But if you instead are pushing an enemy model 5 inches towards you into a pit trap and then charging it, it really changes the math of like what the value of using one of those high cards is. And the fact that it is something you can use on enemy models and does have the purification trigger, that's really the time that I've used it the most. There are models like the Fire Golem is kind of like a prime example of this. Your opponent has a gajillion burning built up on them with their Sandeep or Karis crew, and it's got armor forever. Well, you can also just yell at it, knock the fire off, knock it into a pit trap. Now it has no defenses, and Mah still has 2 more AP to beat it into the dirt with. So, like, you have to be good at identifying when to use it. And to Sam's point, it doesn't always feel great, but sometimes it's really the best decision.
If you are using it offensively to holler somebody towards you, there's no excuse to not do it into a pit trap because the range on her create trap is such that you will always be able to create a trap and then holler in someone into it. Like, it's impossible for someone to be in hollered range,
right?
But to not be hollerable into a pit trap unless you're pushing them through a bunch of other severe first.
Yeah, or if or if you're engaged when you yell. I mean, like, there's a couple of little corner cases, but like generally speaking, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to make a trap. I'm going to use Good for a Laugh to draw 2 cards. Now I have a better sense of what I can actually do with my activation. And then you can make decisions on how you're going to spend your AP for things like yelling, throwing snakes, charging, whatever it is you're going to do. So that's the whole card. There's a lot there. Let's talk about Mah 2, though, and how she differs from Mah 1. So, Sam, why don't you take this one away?
I really want to like Mah 2. So I guess we'll start with what she actually does. So Mah 2 is on a big mecharachnid that her, loving family has built for her. So she is a 50 mil. She is size 4. She has the same ability that Calypso has. So she can't be staggered and ignores a vertical distance while moving. Her biggest sort of front of card change is no longer having chores, but she does now have a couple of interesting auras. One that turns nearby scrap markers into pit trap markers. It's the same aura Sparks has, but on a significantly more durable model. And second, that she has an aura where all friendly models ignore hazardous terrain, which is very useful if you're playing in pit traps because only some models in the crew, actually a pretty small number of models in the crew, ignore pit traps. It's just Mah, the Bushwhackers, and this new guy who we're going to discuss at the very end, Jebediah. So if you're trying to do stupid pit trap games, which is generally the most fun and also probably most powerful way to play Mah, you are really needing to be careful with your own models to avoid them falling into the pit traps and saying ow and getting mad at you. And that doesn't happen with Mah's title because you're just immune to them. Also, incidentally, really good in the mirror for that exact reason. Anyways, in terms of what she actually does, so she has lost chores, as I said, and she has lost her spoon. Instead, she has an oversized drill, which you would think is a more powerful weapon than a spoon because it's a giant metal drill attached to like a diesel engine, and the spoon is just a spoon. But it's not. It's the same as the drill, or it's the same as the spoon, except it's a weak 2 instead of a weak 3. It has a 2-inch range, which is nice, and your opponent can't declare triggers into it, and I believe it ignores armor as well.
Yeah, it ignores armor. Yeah,
it's got a lot of interesting like counter tech that the spoon doesn't have, but its triggers are a lot worse.
Yeah, like it's one trigger that it has.
It is a good trigger, but it is not as good as the spoon triggers.
Yeah, it's a super good trigger. But yeah, Anyway, yes. Take it away.
So, anyways, Mah has also got she has also got a really good gun. It's the same gun the Peacekeeper has, and it has 2 interesting triggers, which we'll get to. She still has Create Trap. She has an ability to target a scrap marker and force the scrap marker to pulse out a duel to enemies that will give them either staggered or stunned if they fail. and she has Scatter, which just pushes enemy models within 3 inches away. So, what I would say the big things with her in terms of strengths are she has a ton of crew mobility, even more than original Mah. Original Mah has horrible holler in, which is good, and she has knock aside. But this Mah has a first of all, she has a trigger on create trap called Secret Tunnel, which is you choose a friendly Tricksy model within 2 inches of the dropped marker, and you place it within 2 inches of another pit trap marker within 6 inches of it. That is an enormous amount of displacement because it's 6 inches from the model to the edge of a pit trap, plus the base width of the pit trap, which is about 1.5 inches, plus 2 more inches, plus the base width of the model you're placing. So it's the equivalent of like a 10-inch move or more. It's very strong. The difficulty with this trigger is that it's keyword locked, and there are very few Tricksy models who you want to be throwing into people's faces.
Yeah.
But what it is useful for is either evacuating somebody from danger, which you actually want to do a lot, or just repositioning someone to like another objective. Similarly, her melee attack has the drop down a hole trigger, which is an outrageously strong trigger. I keep saying things are outrageous, but this is a very outrageous crew. It's a mass trigger, and it's place the target in base contact with friendly pit trap marker within 6 inches of its current position, or scheme marker, but you will always do pit trap for this.
Yeah.
Which is, remember, this is a place. It's a move. It puts them in base contact with a pit trap, so it does get the whole benefit of knocking them into the pit trap. And instead of being a 4-inch like push, it's a place touching a 50 mil model or a 50 mil marker within 6 inches of her or of the model. So again, it's like 8+ inches of displacement. It's a huge kidnap.
And not only is it a kidnap, like you look at Hole in the World and you're like, wow, Hole in the World is so good. It's too good on some models. We have to take it off of blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Now, this one's more restrictive than Hole in the World because it does have to be in base contact with a pit trap or scheme marker. But if you're playing a pit trap heavy Mah build, you're always going to have lots of options. And it's also putting them into base contact with a pit trap, which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. And also remember, this model treats scrap markers within 6 inches of herself as pit traps. Mm-hmm. So you will always have a pit trap. Her gun is, I think, where the real spice is, and this is where you were. This is the attack that makes me want to play this model. It's a 2-3-5, or it's a stat 6 versus defense, 12 inches. It's a 2-3-5, pushes the target 3 inches towards the model, and then it has 2 great triggers. One staggers the target and drops a scrap marker into base contact with them, which is, again, a pit trap. Yeah. Although, remember, this is a drop and not a place, so it won't immediately trigger. But it also has Wave Emitter, which is remove all conditions on the target and all models within pulse 2 of the target, which is kind of insane into condition crews. Like, you're playing against Karis too. Remember, this isn't enemy only. So you can, like, run somebody up into position next to Karis 2's crew, somebody who you think can survive an activation, granted, which isn't that many things, but you can wait till maybe later in the turn when there's not that much left to activate. And then you shoot your own model, and then you pulse out a 2-inch irresistible pulse your opponent can't do anything about and clear all their burning. Or if you don't feel like doing that, if you have good cards, you just shoot the enemy. You shoot somebody, you shoot Karis, and you don't need to get a severe, you just need to hit. So if you have a high enough, card in your hand, you can just force through the hit. And you remove all her burning and all the burning on everyone within pulse 2. So it counteracts enemy focus pulses, which is very strong. It counteracts crews that are trying to stack conditions. It counteracts shielded. It's great. It's very good. Yeah. It also, if the harpoon gun, because it's a 12-inch range, it's a 3-inch pull. So her threat range is 7 inches. So if they are exactly 12 inches away, you can't charge them. But if they're within 10 inches of you, you can shoot them with the harpoon gun, pull them, then charge them, drop down a hole, and now they're like way screwed.
Yeah,
and they're staggered.
I mean, it's a pretty strong kidnap, especially because it's not as resource intensive as some other ones. I mean, to make it happen, you really only need to just hit them with the harpoon gun and then get a mask on the attack. And hopefully they're in a pit trap and injured, so you don't need to dedicate as high a card to it, and blah, 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 blah.
So weaknesses, though.
Yeah. So, I mean, one other quick thing on harpoon gun before we get into weaknesses. Harpoon gun is definitely one that there are situations where, since it's not enemy locked, you may very well want to consider shooting your own model so that you can hit a wave emitter trigger with any tome, because there's no TN on this. if you're playing into a master that really likes to put out debilitating conditions, like a Nelly would be a good example, or like an enemy, zip, or who knows? There's a ton of them. But it's just being able to say, okay, it's a min 2. It sucks that I'm going to have to take some damage, but if I'm going to be able to clear like slow, staggered, and stunned off of a couple of my own models, plus get rid of some conditions on whatever model is engaging my model, okay, this makes sense. Like let's make this happen. Not again ideal, but it's an opportunity to utilize an ability in kind of an
It's lenticular.
yeah.
It is. That's what lenticular means in this context.
Yeah, there you go. It's a lenticular ability, as Sam put before. So it's something that you can use in kind of an unanticipated way that your opponent probably isn't going to be able to plan on.
Yeah, for the non-opticians out there, by the way, when I say lenticular, what I mean is it's an ability that has different sort of use cases or functionality based on how you look at it. Like you look at it one way and it works a certain way, and then you look at it another way and it does something else.
And I won't bore you with the physics of light or optical use case for a lenticular lens, but yeah. Anyway, so weaknesses. There are some issues, and they're going to tie in specifically to this and one of the other front of card abilities on her card, where there is some kind of anti-synergy on this card. Like we've talked about how good the wave emitter trigger is, and genuinely speaking, it is very, very good. But you have to remember that it is remove all conditions on the target and all models within 2. So that includes any negative conditions that you've put onto them, specifically injured. It does not say remove any number of conditions on the target and all models within 2. So if you get this off, you're going to remove any injured that you've been working on getting stacked up on even the target of Mah's attacks or any other enemy models nearby. So that can definitely be an issue. Because it runs counter to how basically the rest of the crew is balanced. The other thing on Heaps of Trash, the thing that lets you ignore, lets Tricksy models, again, keyword locked, within 12 inches choose to be unaffected by hazardous terrain. It does not allow them to ignore severe terrain. And all those pit traps are still severe. Friendly models do get to ignore the pit traps that Mah creates from scrapyard mines. So they can always just choose to be totally unaffected by those. But for the regular vanilla pit traps out there, they're still going to count as severe, and that can definitely be a problem if you're trying to get your crew through them.
So, yeah, those are both true. What I would say are the weaknesses of her crew are kind of more broad spectrum. First is she's fragile. And she doesn't look like it because she's armor 2, but she has only got 11 health, and she's defense 4, and she can be seen from the surface of Saturn. She's a 50 mil size 4. So this is a model where if your opponent has armor piercing or irreducible damage, she's going to go down really fast. Yeah. And these days, the game has a lot of armor piercing and irreducible damage. Like there's just a lot of things in the game that do not care that she's armor 2; they will kill her. So you need to be aware of that. Defense 4 is very bad. And especially it's bad on a model that really wants to be close, like Mah does. She has 6-inch auras she wants her enemy to be in. She has a melee attack that's good. Her gun is fine, but an activation where Mah just shoots 3 times is not a great activation. It's okay, but it's a 2-3-5. It's not turning setting the world on fire. And then she has 2 other weaknesses that I'd say are kind of more broadly kind of philosophical sort of crew design weaknesses. First is that she's every bit as dependent on triggers as her original, but she doesn't draw cards. The original Mah has a front of card draw 2 and 2 good for a laugh triggers. This one doesn't draw any cards. So you're really relying on Big Brain Bryn to stack your hand and maybe out of keyword hires. And that's rough because you want those good cards. You need those. And if you're not getting a bunch of good cards, you're spending a lot of soul stones. And so that's one weakness. The other is that this is very much a model that's great at abducting enemies, setting up the kill, repositioning friendlies, but Tricksy doesn't have a Mancha Roja. It doesn't have an Auntie Mel. It doesn't have a model that you can just like point at an enemy and be like, you, and then just delete it. In Mah 1, that's Mah. That's her role. This Mah can't do that as easily. She doesn't have crit strike. She has a min 2. So you are really much more at the mercy of your pit traps with this version of Mah, which means all the stuff that really I said already screws Mah, the immunity to pit traps, it's much worse on Mah 2 than it is with Mah 1. So I like Mah 2's design and I love her model. It is gorgeous. I do not play her very often because the band of matchups in which she's good is very narrow.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a couple of like specific kind of counter hiring situations that she is very solid. I would say it's probably a fairly small percentage of the time. And, to Sam's point, the thing that gives Mah 1 the edge is that she hits all those bases that Sam talked about before. She can deal a boatload of damage. She can generate a boatload of resources. And she can provide a ton of utility to the crew. This version of Mah does not do a boatload of damage. She has both of her attacks are min 2, and just have I mean, like the drill has a decent melee or damage track. The gun has a very average damage track. They don't read like a typical master action would. She doesn't provide a ton of utility to the crew. Like she can move around a model with secret tunnel. She can pulse out focus, but like it's not as easy to set up because you need to have a scrap marker down so that there's more.
Well, you can have a pit trap down.
Yeah, you could have a pit trap down. That's true because you can treat pit trap.
And you always want to do it off of a pit trap because it's a bigger AOE.
Yeah, so disregard that little thing there. But she doesn't have the same flexibility and she doesn't generate the same amount of resources as Mah 1. So I think that's always going to make her a little more challenging to use. I do think that after putting a lot of mental cycles into her, there's definitely stuff that I need to dig into a little bit deeper. But it always is going to come down to the question of why not Mah 1? And Mah 2 doesn't really provide a lot of reasons to take her instead, in my opinion.
What I would say is if Tricksy at some point got a Mancha Roja style model, which I don't think they will because it's a defined weakness of the crew, or if some of her triggers, or specifically the secret tunnel trigger, was not Tricksy locked, then I would see hiring like an out of keyword or like if Junkyard Treasure and Secret Tunnel were not Tricksy locked. There's your use case. You put a focus on Mancha or Mel, and then you throw them forward, and then like you are generating a bunch of markers for Mancha to smack people with. So there's options there, but in general, yeah, I want to like her, but I'm just not world's biggest fan.
Yeah,
I will say I will declare her in the mirror.
Yeah, definitely. I think she's very strong in the Bayou mirror match.
Well, in the Mah Tucket mirror specifically.
Because
the Mah Tucket mirror specifically, she shuts down pit traps, and Mah just does not deal with Armor 2 models very effectively unless she can make them hazardous.
Right. Absolutely. So that's the two versions of Mah Tucket. Next, we've got the Little Lass, which is the totem. There's not a ton to say here, I don't think. I mean, when you look at the Little Lass, I mean, she's like a cost 2 totem, and she's statted the way that you would expect her to be. She has Pounce, which can come up occasionally. Like, I mean, her big thing is that she has horrible hollering. So you use her to help move your crew upfield and into position turns 1 and turn 2. And if your opponent happens to be in a vulnerable position, like, theoretically, she can get in there and finish a model off with medium-sized Spoon, her 2/3/4 attack that has knock aside and reposition. Thing is that she's stat 4 on both of her attacks, so unless you have got some injured on the enemy, you're probably not gonna reliably be able to kill them. She has Forage, which is like a very weird ability, but it kind of lends to her often being a very late activation. You can occasionally deny a cheeky point by just double walking and then foraging to pick up a scheme marker. Pretty much she's there to holler, and if she dies, she dies, and that's kind of it. Do you have anything to add on the Lass?
2 things. First, she is just you gotta remember her holler is a TN, the same as Maz does, and you need a 7 to hit it, and so I will usually include her in the focus pulse in turn 1 and then spend that focus on the hollering because you really don't want to have to cheat for it. Second thing is I have achieved what I consider to be the best a Little Lass activation is ever going to be, which is I horrible holler in somebody off of a covert marker, cheating a 13 rams to hit him. Then I walked forward and forged that 13 rams back into my hand, eating their sabotage scheme marker.
Wow.
That is the theoretical, achieved under laboratory conditions, maximum thing that the little ass is ever going to do. This is a model that dies turn 2 a lot of the time, and that's okay. However, if your opponent is like really cocky and charges forward and doesn't kill her and gets stuck in the pit trap, the pinball machine, she is really good at killing models that are already injured too and in a pit trap. Like, I recognize that's like saying that somebody is really good at getting things off of a high shelf when there's already a ladder there, but sometimes you just need an activation to kill somebody, and you don't want to spend a good model's activation.
Yep, she can do a respectable enough amount of damage in the right situation that she can finish models off, and it always feels good when you have the little lass kill something like a peacekeeper. It's great.
Yeah, that's the last.
Yeah, that's the last. Next model that we're going to talk about is the man himself, the biggest of the brains, Big Brain Bryn. And boy, oh boy, is this guy good. Big Brain Bryn has been talked about on an innumerable number of other content creation channels. Everybody knows he's good. He's often taken out of keyword in Bayou. He's just phenomenal. But Sam, why don't you give us your broad strokes on Big Brain Bryn?
So one of the strengths of the Tricksy keyword is that it only pays 8 stones for Bryn instead of 9.
Yeah.
Like, this model is good, guys. Like, holy crap. I think Big Brain Bryn is one of the best models from the first wave of the game that's still around.
Oh yeah.
He does so much stuff. So I can't possibly get into everything he can do. The biggest things he does, that are the headliners, are Arcane Reservoir is huge. Calculate the Possibilities is huge in some situations. That's something you want to do later in the turn. Couple things with Calculate. Remember that it flips jokers out of your deck. If you've seen the black but you haven't yet seen the red, you maybe don't want to Calculate unless you really need to stack your hand a bit, but it's also a great action, so you might as well. He got a new lease on life with the heal. The fact that he can now heal his sober up target is really, really big. He has the ability to daze somebody and push them into a pit trap. I could go on. So rather than like do an exhaustive list of everything he does, I'm going to sort of hit some highlights. First of all, the trigger canceling is the strongest thing he does. It's trigger canceling is like an outstanding ability. It is
didn't
so
say
good.
outrageous.
I wanted to fake you guys out. Trigger canceling is insanely good. There are 2 models in the game with knew you were going to do that, and Big Brain Bryn is the better of them. Beyond that, the number of models that can like just actually cancel someone's trigger is really low, and for all of them, it's a defining ability. Like in Lin Li 2's By the Book, that's a model defining ability. Redirect Magic is a model defining ability. 3 Demon Bag is a model defining ability, and all of those abilities are more restrictive than knew you were going to do that. It just like it's really hard to put into words how debilitating that ability is. And so one of the big things that Big Brain Bryn can do is he can just like get into your opponent's face and make their activations suck. Like if Big Brain Bryn, the first game I ever played against Landon, he was playing Lynch 2, and he sent the Hungering Darkness at me, and I charged the Hungering Darkness with Big Brain Bryn. And every turn for the rest of the game, what would happen is Bryn would go first, attack the darkness, make it slow, stack my deck with Calculate the Possibilities, and then sit there. And when he tried to do things with the darkness, he'd like make an attack, and I'd be like, cancel your trigger. Oh, and you're slow. So that's your like, you lose an AP, you lose your triggers. He can stun them. Like, there's just so much stuff he does. So anyways, a few little random big brain tricks. Never forget Intuition. It's hugely important. If you see a really good card on Intuition, you can put that card second, go with Bryn first, and charge a friendly model. And then either cheat or use a tome that you stacked to get Surge to draw the good card. I mean, that does make the models slow, but there are models like the Little Lass where it's kind of like, who cares if they're slow? Plus, if you plan to sober up the model, you can just end the slow condition on them. So you can draw the red Joker pretty easily with that. You can draw 13s. If you see like 1 7 and then 2 bad cards, you can put the 7 on top, calculate, flip past the 2 bad cards. You can flip past the black Joker if your opponent has like used confiscated lore or similar to put the Black Joker on your deck. Landon, again, I was playing him. He was playing Yoko, and he did the thing where it's, you know, you look at the top cards and then put them back in, then remove some of them from the game and then put them back on, or then discard others and put them back on your deck. He put the Black Joker on the top of my deck, and I was like, okay, activate Bryn, Intuition, put the Joker second, calculate the possibilities, flip past it. Like, he's just really insane. You can do really amusing things. I killed Beeb turn 1 in an EVS game because he threw Calypso at me, and I charged Calypso with Bryn and stoned for the Crow because Misdirected Rage is not once per activation, and it doesn't have the Obey rider where a model can only be targeted by it once per activation. And the wording on Belly of the Beast says that even when it's being controlled by an enemy, Calypso could still see Beeb. So I just went, charge your guy, control Calypso, make an attack, do it again. You're dead because you stacked focus on your own model, so I can spend it. Bryn just does a lot. What I will say is that he doesn't do one amazing thing. He does lots of little things. So you really want to have a plan to do multiple of his little things, because if like the only thing he's doing in a turn is calculating, that's not a good activation. Calculate's a good action, but if it's the only thing you're doing, that's not a good activation. You want to be doing multiple things. Oh, one more thing with Bryn. This is actually hugely important for how I play Mah. Is Big Brain Bryn's bonus action that lets models take an action. Usually people just use it on test subjects because they don't die. But that's fine. I mean, test subjects are very good. We're going to talk about them. But the two things I would remember are, first, the removing the marker is a cost. And so you do it regardless of whether the action succeeds, and it's not friendly scheme markers. So you can use it to just remove scheme markers, like move a model up, declare the action, remove the scheme marker, and then you don't care if you succeed or not because the marker's gone. But the other thing about that action is that unlike the overwhelmingly vast majority of AP transfer abilities, it does not restrict you to saying no bonus actions. So one of the most powerful things you can do with that model is target a Soulstone Miner turn 1 and make it drill into the earth, so that same Soulstone Miner can unbury turn 1 and just get out there and murder somebody. This is the linchpin ability that like I use in my build of Mah to like surprise people and kill key models turn 1, and Bryn's a key to that. So like he's just insane. He's really, really strong. I've been talking about him for a while, but he just like does everything. It's really, really hard to find a situation where there's nothing good Bryn can do. And even if he's not doing really anything else, he's sitting there, you know, giving you a 7-card hand, which is fine. Serene Countenance is not as strong a defensive ability as you think, because it is your opponent's just going to like relevant attacks into high value models tend to be focused anyway. But it does mean that if Bryn is sitting in concealment, they can't focus to get past the concealment because Serene Countenance. Yeah. So it has some value there, but don't act like it's going to keep you alive. Protected by you is going to keep you alive a lot more.
Yeah, and you kind of went over most of the stuff that I would make mention of on Bryn's card. I mean, kind of the key things that are really impactful to my particular game plan with him, which may be slightly different than yours, are I have the tendency to really take some time evaluating at the start of the turn if there's anything absolutely critical that I need to do right away. And oftentimes in Mah Tucket versus many other crews, my opponent might be mired in pit traps or in just bad spots, so that even if they go with something before I go with Mah, they probably aren't going to do anything that impactful. So there are definitely situations when you can say, my automatic first activation would be, I'll just go with Mah and beat something up. But you don't always need to. Sometimes you can say, I don't think there's anything that important that my opponent can do to me, so I'm going to go first with Bryn. I'm going to Intuition, stack the deck and say, oh, hey, look at that. It's like a 6 of Rams, and then there's another moderate or maybe even a severe. Who knows? Depends on what I got. Oftentimes it'll be a severe in that top 3, so I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to sober up on Mah. I'm going to end a condition if she has a bad one. I'm going to give her focused 1, and I'm going to heal her for like 3. And then I'm going to calculate, and stack my deck for the rest of the turn. And that severe that I just pitched into the discard pile, I'm actually just going to get to shuffle it back into the deck anyway. So there's not that much of a cost there. Being able to set up and kind of turn luck in your favor for the rest of the turn, if there's not anything really critical that you need to do otherwise first activation, can really warp the way that the rest of the turn works. And every single one of the other things that you have to generate additional card draw has more value than it would have if you had not done the calculate first. I'm never the type of person that calculates twice. I think that's just always a bad decision.
Well, it's once per turn, so.
Well, yeah, you're right. It used to not be once per turn. I'm thinking of pre-errata Bryn. So you definitely can't calculate more than once.
No, you can. You just shouldn't.
You just shouldn't. So that the way that you can kind of warp the deck and the card draw in your favor, I think, has a lot of value, but you have to be good at picking out the situations when it makes sense to do that. All the other stuff that you said about Bryn is absolutely accurate, and he just really kind of plays into supporting a lot of the other models in the crew, and he's one of those additional defensive layers that can help keep Mah, in particular, alive. So, great model. I almost always take him. There are rarely games that I don't, but I would say that there are once in a blue moon a situation when I just don't have the points, and I always kind of feel bad if I have to leave him home. So
yeah, I want to talk very, very, very quickly about Calculate. It's a great ability. Two things about Calculate. First, the later in the turn you calculate, the better. It is an ability that is way better later than it is early. If calculating is something that's very important to you, you might want to hold Bryn's activation. Second, Calculate is very strong and it is once per turn, but that does not mean you have to do it every turn. I know that there are some people who feel like Bryn's activation is wasted if they don't calculate. That is not true. Every other action on Bryn's card is good. Calculating is good. Like, I would like to calculate every turn. It's just an action that's literally never going to be bad unless you fail it. In which case it is then bad. But you shouldn't fail it because you have intuition. What are you doing? Calculate is an action that is good, but it makes your later activations better. So, there's sort of a tension here, right? Where the later you calculate, the better cards you're going to get, and the more likely you're going to redraw one of those 13s. But also, the fewer activations you have to benefit from your now somewhat more stacked deck. So, I find the 2 times to activate Bryn are either early, in which case I'm not always calculating, or late, in which I'm 100% of the time calculating, but never last.
Yeah, no.
Unless, actually, you know what? You would sometimes activate him last, but generally, if I'm activating Bryn last, it's because I am trying to daze somebody, or daze 2 enemy models.
Right. Yeah, and there's definitely, reasons to do that. But again, that kind of plays into the whole skill cap piece of using this crew. Being able to identify the most important times to utilize the abilities on your cards is really a make or break, really with any crew, but I think with Tricksy more than just about anything else.
Yep.
And Bryn plays right into that.
Yeah, and also just like with Bryn, just remember that if you're not using everything on his card, that's normal because it's rare that it'll all come up, but you should still know it all.
Yeah, definitely.
There's not a single rule on his card that I haven't used at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so moving on from Bryn, we have Tricksy Belle, and I'm going to say right off the top, I am a Tricksy Belle apologist. I use her probably more than I should, and I am almost never let down. Before we get into what she does, Sam, what are your experiences with Tricksy Belle? Do you use her as much as I do?
Yes, I'm a Tricksy Belle apologist. I use her way more than I should. I've only recently started using her less, and I have won games that I would not have won if I had used her, but I feel bad about it.
Right.
I like Tricksy a ton. I think that she has very definite weaknesses, and then she has one front of card rule and one back of card rule that matter a ton, and then everything else matters a little bit less.
Yeah.
I think we're probably going to be talking about different rules, but
yeah, probably. So I'll give you my broad brush, just because you took the last model, and then you can tell me why I am right or wrong. So Tricksy Belle, in GG3 is marginally less valuable than she has been previously because she is one of the only models in Bayou that has Don't Mind Me. Don't Mind Me is not as powerful as it has been in the past, but it definitely still has a place. I actually used Trixie Belle several times during the Nova Open, and the Don't Mind Me was literally the thing that scored me a point and swung the game in my favor in multiple situations. Because, yeah, like, okay, I don't mind me to interact with strategy markers, but there's definitely still other stuff you need to do. Like, let's say you're around to guard the stash and you're trying to outnumber your opponent, or you're playing covert and you're trying to deny their ability to score by engaging them with Trixie, but you can still do other things that require scheme markers. And there's a bunch of them out there. So Don't Mind Me is powerful in the right situations. The other big one that she has is Ill Omens. It's one of only a handful of models in the game with it, and the fact that you have access to two of them in Trixie, it does a lot of the same thing that sometimes people will take that same upgrade 2 times in Neverborn to accomplish to get the Ill Omens +2. Manipulative is very solid, and oftentimes the reason that it is so important on Trixie as opposed to other models is there is very, very, very rarely a reason to activate her early. There will sometimes be situations that you need to do that, but more often than not, she is a very late activation model that you're using to score or deny points. So manipulative gets a lot more value on her than it does on some other models that have pressure to activate very early. She's got typical lore stat 7, but the big thing with her is that she has a built-in trigger to move the model away from Trixie instead of towards her, and it's been that way since 2nd edition, and it still catches people off guard basically every time that I play her.
In 2nd edition, it wasn't a trigger; it was part of the ability.
It was just part of the ability, and it was
called Gremlin Lure,
which was ridiculous. Lures at 18 inches. Let's not put that back in the game. Weird. Thanks.
It also pushed them their charge, which was different from their move. So I won a game in 2nd edition because Tony Ironsides got pushed 8 inches back every single turn, like multiple times sometimes.
Yep. I remember pushing Yasunori 10 inches away because its charge was 10 and its move was like 6 or 7. Happened on the regular. But anyway, that's a different edition. So the lure is, just as good as any other lure, but also better because you can push models away and you can use it to push things into the ever-present pit traps, which is pretty dope. The other very important thing to remember on her card is that no, she cannot deal damage. She has no ability on her own to deal damage at all. But her main attack, Sharp Wit, which just gives slow, has a built-in mask to get 2 incredibly good triggers, coordinated attacks. So like if you tag team Tricksy with Mah Tucket, you're hitting with a stat 6 on willpower, so most of the time you're plus stat anyway, especially because if the model's already injured, they're probably going to be at like stat 4 or less. And then you're also getting to attack with Mah's 3-4-5. You're Coming With Me is a very, very powerful trigger, and it's not as effective as it's not as effective a kidnap ability as maybe some other models that have it like Zip. But again, like you're pushing the model up to 3 inches in any direction, ostensibly, into pit traps or out of scoring range, and then you get to place in base. And very importantly, it has draw out secrets. So if there's ever a circumstance where like the Don't Mind Me isn't going to be sufficient, or there's something else that's preventing you from dropping scheme markers with an interact, like playing against Stupid Nelly, you can still use some resources to drop a scheme marker and score some points with the draw out secrets on her melee attack. So I realize I talked about basically everything on her card, but those are the things that are important to me. And then as a bonus, she has a free loot, which is like an amazing bonus action to pick up enemy scheme markers and draw cards. So awesome. And get a place out of it too.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So Trixie, to me, the biggest thing on her front of card is Ill Omens. Winning initiative really is important. It is important for reasons that are fairly self-explanatory. It's more important in this crew because of how fragile you are. I don't think I need to dwell on it. It's very strong. At the same time, I would not pay 8 stones for a blank card with Ill Omens. Or 7 stones, however much she is, I don't remember. So you do need to kind of be a little bit thoughtful with it.
She's only 7 stones.
She's 7 stones. Still wouldn't. But it is an important rule. It's again, this is another Ill Omens is another one of those examples where 2 is more than twice as big as 1. Ill Omens 2 is a lot bigger than Ill Omens 1 because now you're in a situation where you can cheat initiative with a card that you don't care about as much, and your opponent has to cheat a real card. And also, because you are often going for a very specific chore, you often don't have total freedom with this crew to cheat whatever you need to win initiative. So this means that you have a better chance of winning initiative while also getting the chore you want. So I think cheating initiative is better with this crew than most.
Yeah.
On the backup card.
The other thing I would just kind of chime in on the Ill Omens piece is there are occasionally going to be those games where you have a turn that you have to go first. Like, it is critical. And there's always that risk in just about every other crew where you're like, I'm going to cheat a 13 and my opponent's holding the stupid red joker. With this crew, Ill Omens +2 or Ill Omens 1 and a pass token that you've held over from the previous turn most of the time makes it so that your opponent literally cannot even tie you on initiative, which is extremely important from just a basic math standpoint.
Agreed. So on her backup card, when I first started playing Tricksy again this edition, I did a lot of luring, and every time I play her, I use lure less and less and less. Yeah. And I think that lure is not a bad ability, but one of the big things that I find with lure is that often I don't want somebody who's 12 inches away to get closer to me. This is, as we've said, it's a crew that's fragile. It's also a crew that is very good at killing kind of one model at a time because you have to focus effort. It's very rare that anyone aside from Mah can like one round somebody. So once you've got somebody kind of in the pinball machine, then you don't want somebody else in there too. So usually you can if you're what lure to me is for is if you're and like again your opponent could be playing cagey, but you're really good at shooting. This crew is going to win most shooting duels, especially since its main shooters are stealthed. So there's a lot of incentive for your opponent to come towards you. So lure is useful. I mean, obviously it's a very strong action, and the flexibility of being able to push somebody away is important. But in terms of like how to use it offensively, I would much rather just sharp wit somebody because you're coming with me is really, really good when you're pushing somebody into a pit trap, and sharp wit also makes them slow. And as we've said, making somebody slow and in a pit trap is just like nightmarish. Like, I mean, the base case for that is your opponent loses their whole activation to slamming the pit trap away, right? Like that sucks. Then you can even like I've had situations where I attack somebody with Tricksy, you're coming with me them into a pit trap, then attack them again, even though they're already slow and cannot be made slow again, and just push them around in the pit trap some more.
Yeah.
Because I already hit them, so they are now, they have a lower willpower because they're injured, so it's easier for me to sharp with them again.
Yeah.
So,
and the really key thing with that is that because of the timing that you usually activate Tricksy Bell, it's not just that you're putting slow on a model and putting them into a pit trap, but you're probably doing it after they've activated. So when they activate next turn, they are slowed and in a pit trap and in base-to-base contact with a model that has manipulative and hasn't activated yet. So it literally completely shuts down a lot of models next activation.
That is true, but my experience of this is that if you hit somebody with Trixie's sharp wit and you're coming with me them into a pit trap, they don't get an X activation.
Well, there is that too. Yeah.
So I actually prefer to do it on models that haven't activated yet because it your opponent, first of all, a lot of opponents will panic and try to then try to activate the model immediately to get it out, which surprise they won't do because they're in severe terrain and engaged and slow.
Yeah.
But also it means they'll burn activations trying to rescue that model. And they often will fail. And sometimes they'll succeed and they'll just have spent basically a whole activation to not do much. So I don't necessarily activate her late. I respect those who do. I think it's not it's not wrong to activate late, but I will often activate her early and then just try to basically get somebody into a horrible spot.
The reach that she has to remove an enemy scheme marker is oftentimes very difficult for your opponent to actually put into perspective, because if you know that your opponent needs a particular scheme marker down to score, leave your mark is an excellent example. If they make a mistake and drop a leave your mark marker in the center of the table, or they're trying to go for that end of game point, it's very, very trivially easy for Tricksy to either just double walk and then bonus to get a marker that's another 3 inches. And now she's got a 13-inch range where she can just remove a marker, score a point, and draw a card, which is great. There's also times that you can combo up the built-in you're coming with me on her sharp wit to like walk, charge, you're coming with me, push a model 3 inches, place and base contact on the other side of it, and then free loot to pick up a scheme marker within like it's like an absurd distance. So that's the kind of thing that can be very frustrating for your opponent to deal with, and oftentimes they have no idea that you can even do it.
So I'm more bearish on free loot than most people, and than you as well. I think actually a significant downside of this model is that she often does not have a bonus action, especially in GG3 where there's just not that many enemy scheme markers being dropped. I think that it is a defined weakness of this model that she has. Her only bonus action is this very conditional action, so you are often spending 7 stones for 2 AP, which is not something you often really want to be doing in Malifaux. I'll accept that it's sometimes useful, but there's also a lot of scheme marker removal. Like you've got forage on the little ass and on test subjects, so it's very like taking Tricksy is just another example. It's adding another model to your crew with a bonus action that only is ever conditionally relevant. Like I'd say the majority of my Tricksy games, she never takes a bonus action. So
yeah, I would agree.
I would definitely pay 8 stones for this model if she had a real bonus action. 7 stones with no bonus actions is a little bit more of a tough sell. But if they like, if she got like, I don't know, even just create trap, and like with like a reasonable trigger on it, like create trap with like a reposition or something, I would be a lot happier. But I mean, I don't think she's terrible, but you should be aware that if your opponent's not dropping scheme markers, you're often going to take 2 AP activations with her, which is not good.
Yeah, she's definitely not an always hire. She's one that I make decisions on mostly based on what the encounter looks like. If I can see, 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 schemes that she's going to be able to, reasonably speaking, deny, there's a good chance that she's also going to be able to help score those because she does have the draw out secrets. And then the lure is always good for her because there's I don't think there's ever a game where positional scoring is not a factor to at least some degree. It would have to be a really skewy scheme pool for the lure to almost never bring value. And then even if it's not bringing value from a scoring standpoint, it's, again, has pit trap synergy. So she's a great model. She's often the one that ends up getting cut first if I need to make up stones. But I would consider her to be part of my kind of core crew and that first flex slot. So
sounds good.
Next up, we have the survivors. Survivors are delightful. They are exactly what they sound like. They're super durable. They actually share Foundry as well, which is pretty cool. They're one of the cross keyword models that sees a lot of play in my version of Mei Feng. They are just generally pretty dang solid models, and I think probably one of the best values for a 5-stone minion in the game. There's not like a super ton to talk about with them. They're just great at holding a space. They're great at holding an objective. They have a 14-inch gun. They do still have an engage, so they can, do stuff in covert, even though it's a 0. It's not great. They have magnetism, which is particularly good with Mah 2 because you can treat all those pit trap markers as scraps when they're within 6 inches of her. Very, very solid. I often will find myself taking one, especially for like hidden martyrs. They're real good for that. Just great models and a great way to fill the last couple of points in the crew. Any broad brush stuff you want to share on them, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I love the models, and I played a bunch of them in 2e, even though they were not good then.
Yeah.
I mean, I was not very good at Malifaux 2nd Edition. I played Mah Tucket before Manifest Destiny, so don't necessarily take that 2nd Edition Malifaux advice from me. I am bearish on survivors, and I want to like them because the models are great and the concept is great. But I actually feel like I overcorrect. I don't use them enough. First of all, they are almost always a 3-action model because magnetism is a really easy action to get use out of. That said, they want you to go heavy into scrap marker synergy, and that means you're either playing Mah 2 or you're also hiring the mech chop and scraps or sparks rather, which means you're not hiring the kind of crew that I typically like to hire. So I see the value of them. I don't often take them though. I think that with the rock hopper, they gained some value because because the rock hopper is good enough to just take. You don't need a bunch of scrap synergy for it, and or I don't think so anyway. And magnetism can push towards it, so that helps. Because magnetism is very, very good. Let's be clear. Magnetism is a very, very strong action. It is basically a better version of Onward or Creep Along in a lot of ways. if you are willing to do the work to set it up. And if you're not willing to do the work to set it up, you shouldn't be hiring these guys in the first place. That said, they have a 0-inch melee and a stat 5 gun with a minimum 1. You really don't want to be in like investing cards in these guys because they're just not great. And if you don't invest cards in them, their attack often just does nothing. They're also competing directly against bushwhackers for having 14-inch guns, and the bushwhacker gun is just way better. But one thing people say a lot about 5-stone minions is the 5-stone minion problem is that 5-stone minions just die. These guys do not just die. They are a 5/6 with armor and hard to kill. And constructs are pretty easy to heal because you've got Sparks' Wrench. So I feel like survivors are worth thinking about if you're willing to hire multiple of them and go in on the foundry aspect of the crew, and you don't need to be playing Mah 2 to do that.
Right. I will say that they fit extremely well into a Mei Feng crew, probably even more than they do into a Mah Tucket crew. And, just like you said, they're very, very durable, survivable models, and the Scamper does help to kind of band-aid some of the issues with having a 0-inch engage. Generally solid. I think that in Mah 1, most of the time it's like, is it going to be a survivor or a bushwhacker? Oh, I'm maxed on bushwhackers. Is it going to be a survivor or a soulstone miner, which we'll talk about next, or one of any number of other small, like, low cost models. That's something that you're going to kind of see as we go through the rest of the things in here, but this is definitely one of the keywords that does like the multiple small units theme of building better than most. It's really spoiled for good options for low or mid cost minions that you'll sometimes take multiples of. That said, survivors, very, very solid. Don't always take them. When I do take them, I'm generally okay with how they perform. And most of the time, it's just going to be for, like, I need a cheap model that I know is going to be able to survive near an objective, or I need a good Hidden Martyrs target. That's pretty much it.
So we haven't been saying the, like, always hire, sometimes hire thing. I don't know if you want us to.
Sure.
But yeah, I would say that just of so far, obviously, Bryn's an always hire. Tricksy is sometimes. Survivors are sometimes. They're sort of towards the low end of sometimes. And I'd say the asterisk on this is that I will never just throw a survivor into a list. If I'm hiring a survivor, I'm hiring Sparks, and I'm probably hiring at least another survivor, maybe even the Mech Chop.
Yep. So I would agree exactly with what you just said, and that kind of ties right into the next model on the list, which is the Soulstone Miner. For a long time, I was really kind of down on Soulstone Miners. I was like, they're okay. I feel like people crutch on them too much. I didn't really use them. And then I came to my senses and I'm like, okay, these things are actually pretty solid, and they have so much synergy with the rest of the keyword, especially the kind of big brain Bryn trick that Sam had just mentioned, that they're pretty darn solid models. These things have been talked about ad nauseum in many, 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 many other episodes of many, many other podcasts and YouTube channels out there. The unique things that they really do with this keyword are going to be that you can do the bury unbury thing in the same turn, and you can put focus on them with Mah before they activate or before they bury themselves. That way, when they do unbury, potentially turn 1 if you're using Bryn, or certainly turn 2, there's a good chance that they're actually going to be focus 1 or in some cases focus 2, which is a legitimate threat. I mean, you have a model that is only a 2-3-4 track, but it does always ignore resist triggers, has 1 or 2 focus, and has both armor piercing and drop down a hole, which are very, very strong. And they can really ruin your opponent's day. So anything else to add on these, Sam?
I am the world's #1 Soulstone Miner enjoyer. These guys are an always take. In fact, one of them is an always take, and most lists I build have 2 Soulstone Miners in it because I am a psychopath. I typically have 3 stones in my cache when I start the game, and I end the game with more than 3 stones in my cache after spending multiple ones every turn, because Soulstone Miners are so good. So I love Soulstone Miners. I will sing their praises all day. I think these guys are absolutely bananas, in Tricksy specifically. The biggest things they do, besides letting you start with a small cache, are drop down a hole. I really cannot stress enough what an absolutely bonkers trigger drop down a hole is. A very, very common turn 1 play for me. Like, by common, I mean I do this probably in more than 50% of my Mah games, is focus pulse with Mah to put focus on everyone, including my miners. Make Bryn bury a miner. cycle cards throughout the turn using Mah's Good for a Laugh and like Calculate. So I have like a really stacked hand, including at least one high mask. Use pass tokens to hold the Soulstone Miner's active, like the Soulstone Miner to be my second to last model to activate. Basically, usually I have a Soulstone Miner and then like a Bushwhacker as my other model. And then once my opponent is mostly activated out, or even fully activated out, if I, because I do have 2 pass tokens, I will go. I activate a Soulstone Miner. I don't stun the second Soulstone Miner because this is the one that's already buried. Because I want triggers. I unbury near one of your models that you foolishly moved 1 inch out of your deployment zone. Although sometimes if they moved far enough out, I just unbury in base contact with them. And then I go drop down, like attack you with focus, cheat in a high mask to drop you down a hole. That is, again, the range is 6 inches from your base to a 50 mil pit trap, which I can then place you in anywhere base contact with. But usually what I'll do is I will have placed pit traps a bit outside, like about 10 inches outside of their deployment zone, so that they're within 6 inches when they take that first walk. And I'll have done that using my start of game places with Bushwhackers and Mah. And then I will throw you into a pit trap, dealing 3, 4, 5 damage and injuring you. Then I will charge, because I haven't charged yet, into you, and I will attack you again at effectively stat 6 this time. And again, I've got a bunch of high cards in hand. So here, if I have another mask, like, holy crap, you are dead. But even if I don't have another mask, like, I'll just use one of the other good triggers they have. Like, if it's a weak model, like a minion that they moved out, I can just kill it and get a Soulstone with the Crow trigger. If it's got armored, they have armor piercing. But usually what I'm doing this on is like a pretty significant model, like an enforcer or even a henchman. And so they're in a pit trap. Ideally, they've been thrown in the pit trap twice, so they're double injured, but I'll frankly take one. And then I finish the activation, and then I activate my Bushwhacker and shoot them with focus to get around the friendly fire problem. And I either crit strike them, or I get the clever ruse on the Bushwhacker and push them into the pit trap again. And then I win initiative next turn because I have Ill Omens too, and their model is completely dead.
Yeah.
So, like, I have had... So just as an example of this, at Nova, I believe it was at Nova, I was playing into a Zoraida list that was kind of the standard Zoraida All-Stars with a Mature and Hinamatsu. He does the standard thing. He burns out Hinamatsu and shoves her way forward, and then Hinamatsu gets a turn 1 charge into a Bushwhacker who is like sitting near a covert marker and attacks me, and I cheat a high card to make it miss, and he cheats a high card to make it hit and deals like 3 damage, and then I push away with Scamper, and Hinamatsu's activation ends, feeling sad. And then I unbury a Soulstone Miner next to Hinamatsu, throw her into the pit trap that Bushwhacker made, damage her, charge her, attack her again with armor piercing, and kill her.
Yeah.
Like, brutal. Well, she didn't technically, she died turn 2, but
she was gonna die. I mean, she was
at like 2 health in a pit trap. So, these guys are nuts. Like, holy crap. I know I've been talking for a minute on them, but the big thing with them is the ability to unbury turn 1 late in the turn when because of your pass tokens, with a stacked hand because of your card draw, and then pick an enemy model that's like made the foolish mistake of leaving its deployment zone and throw it into a pit trap, and then possibly even do it again. I've never pulled this off, but you could theoretically throw them into a pit trap, charge them in that pit trap, and then get the trigger again and throw them into another pit trap closer to your lines and kind of ladder them over to you. It's crazy. They are very fragile, even with armor. Generally with them, I will activate them first and last in the turn. First to, like, at the start of the turn, I'll activate them to either, if they're already on the table, get their attacks in and then disappear before anything bad can happen to them. Or if they're already buried, unbury them to quickly set up pitch somebody into a pit trap, and then, accept that I'm probably going to lose the miner. Or I'll activate them late in the turn to unbury.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you do the two Soulstone Miner thing with Bryn, I mean, you can go with Mah Tucket before any of those models go, pulse out a focus, do whatever Mah Tucket's going to do. Bryn goes, makes one of the Soulstone Miners bury so that it can then unbury the same turn. The other Soulstone Miner takes its activation at some point, creates a Soulstone, focuses so now that it's at focus 2 and buries.
Yep, and then turn 2, it can pop out.
turn 2 he can pop out anywhere more or less he needs to with focus 2. The first one can pop out turn 1 with focus 1 and do all the stuff you just said. Like, they're just very, very, very solid models, and they're one that I'm looking forward to utilizing even more as time goes on, because I've recently woken up to how brutal they can be to deal with. They're not like unmanageable for your opponent. Like, to your point, they are pretty fragile. If they have anything that attacks willpower, they're super vulnerable to it because they're only willpower 3. And they don't really have enough health to stick around that long. I mean, 5 wounds armor 1 is not very tough. So, like, if you're not careful,
they die. They will die.
They will die. But yeah, very strong and great combinations with this particular keyword, probably more so than even most stuff in Arcanists. I think they actually are. They're essentially Bayou models that can also go into Arcanists.
Yeah, I mean, so with these guys, the other thing to remember is, and this is really important, but it's part of why Mah is, I think, in my opinion, the best master in the game at Covert. The turn they unbury, they are ignored for friendly schemes and strategies. They are not ignored for enemy strategies.
Right.
So they can deny your opponent's Covert, and because they can come up anywhere on the board, and because, or not anywhere on the board, but anywhere a Covert marker is.
Yeah.
And because you have pass tokens to guarantee yourself the last activation, you can very easily spend the entire, if you really want to do it, this is going to, I rarely do this because it's such a heavy commitment, but you can, if you want, 100% lock your opponent out of Covert.
Yeah, it's definitely doable. I mean, you kill the models that go towards the center, you deny with models that go off onto the flanks, and you just score your points and they don't. It's
yeah. I usually with Covert, it's not worth it to try to deny all 4 points, but you can pretty easily lock them at 1.
Yeah, I mean, even keeping them at 1 or 2 strat points is most of the time going to mean a win for you. And hey, that's all that matters, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So,
literally the only thing that matters. I don't care about anything else in my life.
So test subjects, we could probably spend half an episode talking about these guys, and I super duper love them because they do real janky stuff. It's a real shame that we unfortunately weren't able to have Maeve join us today because she would wax poetic on these guys, but man, talk about probably the best 4-stone model in the game.
Oh, yeah. Big margin.
Yeah.
Now that the Soulstone game had been nerfed, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, so all the stuff that made survivors great also makes test subjects great. They don't have hard to kill, but they are a 4-stone model with 6 wounds and armor 1, which is kind of amazing.
And defense, actually high if you are stacking hazardous on them.
Right. So basically, they ignore the damage from hazardous terrain, and the important thing is that they don't ignore the hazardous terrain. They just ignore the damage from it. So they can still get conditions like, burning and injured and stuff like that.
Injured.
But importantly, injured actually increases their defense and willpower instead of decreasing it. So if you get 1 injured on them, then their defense 5, and then it goes to 6, and very quickly goes to 7 or 8. In most situations, unless your opponent is really sticking around close to pit traps, you're probably not going to get more than 2 injured, maybe 3 on them, but it can happen. And you can't just park them in a pit trap and expect them to do whatever it is they need to do, unless your opponent is kind of playing around the edges of them so that you can kind of bop in and out of it, because they don't ignore the severe aspect of the pit traps, which is very important. But they get to do lots of wacky stuff. They have a rule called Happy Accident, which they're the only model in the game that has this rule, where they can't be killed by effect other than reducing their health to 0.
Which just basically means, usually Big Brain Bryn's pulling the strings, but also executes, don't kill them. And is there anything else that's not? I know second edition had weird 7 executes.
I don't know. If it comes up, it comes up. But most of the time, it's intended as Big Brain Bryn synergy. And there was some pretty wacky stuff you could do with test subjects in Summerteeth Jones but they fixed that. Because you could blow them up without actually blowing them up.
Yep.
To deal pulse damage, but that they fixed that. So sorry, Summer. Right. The other stuff that they do is mostly just gumming up your opponent's game plan. Anytime the other thing that's very important is as part of their shock therapy front of card ability, anytime they get pushed, they can take a charge. Granted, they still have to follow the normal rules for charges, so they can't do that if they're engaged. Very important. But Scamper is a push. Hey, how about that? Plus, there's lots of other things in the game that just do incidental pushes. that all of a sudden your opponent's like, oh wait, if I push this model like with a scatter, for instance, it's actually a charge instead of a push. And yeah, they just get in your opponent's face. They're not insignificant because that's awesome. And yeah, they're just generally great models. And then, they do have a ranged attack, which is stat 5, which is great. And just kind of baseline ignores armor. Granted, that only actually matters if they hit most of the time moderate or importantly severe, because their track is 1, 2, 4. But I have had a couple of games where I've gotten like a cheeky focused electrical shock and killed like an ice golem because I hit it for 4, ignoring armor. Sometimes it happens. They're pretty great. I love them.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are just absolutely bananas for 4 stones. So they're super super durable for 4 stones, like armor and 6 wounds and ignoring certain sources of damage. Admittedly, just hazardous, but it's not nothing. Is like a really crazy amount of durability for a 4 stone significant model. I underhire these. I do not hire them as much as I should because I love soulstone miners and bushwhackers so much, and it's hard to get these guys in when you have those. But it's easy to maybe drop a bushwhacker for one of these. It saves you a stone, and you do not usually need 3 bushwhackers, even though I love hiring 3 bushwhackers. So they're good. They're very good at just existing in a spot, which is something that's actually pretty strong in this GG, like existing in a spot. That said, they don't really do much besides existing in a spot. Like, the free charge is nice, but their attack like sucks. Like, it can make somebody slow sometimes, which is the absolute sort of best thing it can do, which is good. Like, don't get me wrong, spending a 4 stone model's activation to make a 8 or 9 or 10 stone model slow is a objectively correct use of resources. But it's still you're investing stones in models that like sit in a spot and don't do too much aside from that. However, that is really strong in this GG. Like, sitting in a spot is good. It's good for covert. It's good for guard the stash. Just remember, they are significant. You can do all kinds of fun stuff with them. That's generally what they're for, is like scheming. If scheme markers come back in GG4, their stock is gonna go up really hugely because forage is really good. As it is, again, like Tricksy, they really are kind of 2 AP models. Which is something.
But really, most of the time they're 3 AP models because you're taking Bryn and they let him use his bonus action without needing to spend resources to put a scheme marker down first. So 2 AP during their activation, but realistically speaking, they're probably 3 because they're always going to be hanging out with the big boss.
Well, to be true, but if I'm playing Bryn, I would probably interact with them to create the scheme marker, which I can then use on the Soulstone Miner, because it's just, again, taking an action with them is cool, but like, what are you going to do with that action? They're bad at doing things. Like, they're good models, but they're bad at doing things.
The big thing, one of the other big call-outs with them is that they do have Stampede, which, like, you're taking a 4 stone 6 wound model with armor 1, you kind of have a lot of flexibility to use that Stampede more than you would on maybe some others. And there are so many times. Yeah, it's huge. There are so many times where I'm like, oh, that model's at 1. I'm just going to kill it without flipping any cards. And very, very sad day for my opponent.
Remember that Stampede is not once per activation or once per turn or anything. So you can Stampede off of your free push charges. Which you will often do. In fact, I think that there is a use case for taking 3 of these guys together and keeping them in a cluster, because if you have some way of pushing multiple models at once, your opponent does, which I'd have to look at the cards, but I'm sure you can hire something in Bayou that does that. Like, I mean, just hire Bo Peep. That's fine. Just hire Bo Peep, and then you get 3 free charges, which means 3 free Stampede pings on the target. That's really strong. Like, really strong.
And there are definitely times where I have literally killed models in the middle of my opponent's activation because they have Scamper, and my opponent had to cheat something that was critical, and then they got to like charge and Stampede something during their activation, damaged it, hit it with the attack, and it was dead. It's super frustrating for your opponent to deal with, and if they die, they die. They're 4 stones. Like, I don't care.
If he dies, he dies.
If he dies, he dies. That's right. So they're great. You should take them. Taking 3 is definitely something that you can do, and it is not a bad idea. And it will make for a very frustrating day for your opponent, and a really fun day for you.
The most powerful use of AP that these guys have is in cursed objects interacting to put a cursed token on an enemy model.
Yeah, really obnoxious. Super, super obnoxious. So with that said, we're going to move on to the last two keyword models in the good bucket. And I apologize. I should have apologized in advance. This is for sure going to be the longest episode we've ever had. But we're having a ball talking. So here we go. We'll try to buzz through the rest of it so we don't keep you guys on the line
sorry,
for like 5
I did
hours.
not realize how late it was.
Yeah, no, we're good. So bushwhackers, we've already talked a lot about them. They're amazing. I almost always hire 2. I very frequently hire 3. I think, again, they're the gold standard for an excellent low-cost minion. 6 stones, they've got a gun that ignores cover. 2/3/5 has crit strike and a trigger that's unique to them, Clever Ruse. Push 3 inches towards a pit trap marker in line of sight. That is low-key.
Not unique to them anymore.
Well, not unique to them anymore.
Cooper has it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So they're pretty amazing. Clever Ruse is low-key one of the best things on their card, given the right situation. And they have all the other stuff that Mah Tucket and the crew have. They have Scamper. They can drop pit traps. They ignore pit traps. Very importantly, they have From the Shadows, and they have Stealth, which are incredibly powerful abilities, especially in combination with each other. And the rest of their card is pretty vanilla. It's pretty straightforward, nothing that complicated to it. The thing that they do is punish your opponent for poor deployment and poor choices, especially on turn 1. I can't tell you the number of times that I've looked at my opponent's crew and said, I don't really need to From the Shadows very far because I just don't need to based on the situation. I'm just going to deploy myself so that I'm within 3 inches of where Mah Tucket is going to end up being when she does her focus pulse out focus to all of them, and then later on in the turn my opponent just walks a model 2 inches too close. They just take a walk focus shot, cheat in a ram and a high face card to do 6 damage and kill the model turn 1. It's really, really, really brutal, and sometimes you can do really abusive stuff with the From the Shadows, in a very wide deployment. Basically use them plus the pit traps you can set up at the beginning of the game to block off entire movement lanes to get to the corner markers. Nasty models. I love them to death, and I hire 3 probably more often than I should, but I always get value out of them. So that's bushwhackers. Sam, what you got?
I mean, people who know me, they just know that I love whacking. I'm always whacking. I wake up in the morning and I start whacking it, and I'm just whacking and whacking all day. And by the end of the day, I'm all whacked out, but my opponent has been totally whacked off. I love bushwhackers. These guys are great. Holy crap. I'm going to try to keep this brief for the aforementioned reasons. First of all, you hit most of the important stuff. Clever Ruse is a really big deal. I find Crit Strike is more significant for them because their number 1 role is Totem Assassin.
Yeah, for sure.
These guys, if your opponent has a Def 5 totem or less, these guys can just be if your opponent has a Def 5 totem and you don't have to focus because there's no concealment, you can just be 4 health or less, dead. Or if I have crit strikes, I can take 1 big focus shot. They ignore cover, so they will always get that. They don't ignore concealment, but you can focus past it. Ignoring cover is actually a really big deal, not because of the neg flip to damage, but because of the stat boost. It's your opponent can't can't take a Def 5 totem, hide it behind cover, and then save a 13 to keep it alive. So yeah, these guys are just the 2 things besides the Totem Assassin aspect of it that I like that I just want to touch on, make sure we mention are, first, they give you start of game pit traps.
Yeah.
Pit traps are really important, as we've discussed ad nauseum, but positioning them is harder than it sounds because the ability that makes them is a 2-inch range ability that can't be used while you're engaged. So it's often difficult to get pit traps kind of exactly where you need them on the line of scrimmage, and the ability to start the game with multiple pit traps in play anywhere on the board that you want outside of I think it's 3 inches of their deployment zone. It's this super open
amount of area.
Amount of area that is very, very important. So that's a big deal. And the other big deal is that especially on flank and corner deployments, not at all on wedge, especially on flank and corner, a little bit on standard, but especially on corner, the fact that you can deploy these guys at the start of the game controlling stash markers or covert ops markers means you don't have to proactively go out there to get on those markers. Your opponent has to proactively come to you to stop you. And that's really, really important. A really important position for Mah Tucket to be in, because you want to control the flow of the game. You want your opponent to be reacting to what you're doing. And this means your opponent is on the back foot from the activation. And then just the last thing I'll mention with them, just be careful of this with timing. Because you from the shadows them, they do you have to look at the strategies. You do technically get a marker, whatever token it's called, for covert ops, because those get handed out, I believe, on the start phase of the first turn. Your opponent cannot put a curse token on them with cursed objects, because at the time that is being done, they're not on the board yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I did a couple of times during Nova. There were, I think 2 or 3 games where I hired crews where there were only 4 legal targets for my opponent to put curse tokens out on at start of game, because they couldn't put them on any of my bushwhackers and my totem is insignificant. So they have to double up curse tokens on something, which is extremely bad for your opponent and significantly reduces the chances that they're going to be able to score. The only downside to that is that it does make bushwhackers kind of a target on turn 1, because they know that they can kill them freely without costing themselves points. But bushwhackers aren't the easiest things to get to grips with, especially if you play with them carefully. So very, very important. And yeah, like we said, bushwhackers are pretty darn good. All right. So that pretty much sums up bushwhackers. They're pretty amazing and definitely one of the models that I crutch on like a whole heck of a lot when I play this particular keyword.
Yeah, I can't imagine not hiring at least one. Like, if I'm in a matchup where bushwhackers are bad, like, why am I playing Mah? I guess I declared Masters first, so I don't know. But like, if I'm in any matchup where Mah has a reasonable chance, at least one bushwhacker will be fine.
And I think that honestly is probably the biggest issue that I've had with Mah 2, is that I've taken Mah 2 and tried to do like the super construct Mah 2 list that you think you should, based on how her keyword centered, but how her card works. And in retrospect, like, I'd probably be better off just basically hiring more or less a traditional Mah 1 crew, but then just using Mah 2 instead. That's something I'm going to have to try in the future. But anyway, the last model in the quote good bucket that I have designated as good anyway is going to be the Rooster Rider. The Rooster Riders are probably my favorite keyword model, and that's not just because I keep chickens. These guys are scoring machines. Granted, they are very fragile. And Sam may have had a different experience with them, since Sam said that he typically hires, 2 to 3 bushwhackers and then also often 2 soulstone miners. And Bryn, like, that doesn't really leave a whole lot of space for roosters. So I think that's probably one of the spots that I'm guessing our traditional builds kind of diverge from each other. But there's not a whole lot to say on these guys aside from the fact that they have reckless, they are move 7. They have grit frantic. So if somebody does end up knocking them down to half, or they just incrementally ping themselves down to half as the game goes on, they can suddenly kind of explode and have monstrously high damage activations, or just kind of die. They do have a 14-inch gun, which is a 2-3-5 track with no way to increase its damage. The only trigger they have on it is a reposition. I use these guys as flankers. If I need to run something down the table, like if I'm playing, what do you call it? Carve a Path. This, or maybe even like an out of keyword Silurid, are usually going to be my picks if I need to run something down a table edge. They do have some significant weaknesses in that they have a 0-inch engage. Scamper does help with that to a degree, but they can kind of be locked down. The big thing that they have is that if they do end up on a flank against another schemer, they will almost always win that fight because they're fast and they have a ton of damage potential. Not much else to say on these guys. They're not very refined tools. But Sam, what do you think about the old Rooster Riders?
I don't like them. Sorry, everybody.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah, I don't like them. I mean, listen, I get it, right? Like, it's a move 7 model with reckless. The problem is it's also a cost 7 model, and they die. Like, I think there was a period in 3rd edition when Rooster Riders were a reasonable choice because the game has gotten more deadly over time.
For sure.
It's pulled back a bit from the sort of extremes with the nerfs to Malifaux, Burns, and Madness, but it's definitely a game that, especially in this GG, is really focused on, like, projecting threat and power and killing things. And these guys just die. And 7 stones is way too expensive for a model that is this fragile.
Yeah, and they're even more fragile than they look because they're almost always going to be utilizing Reckless. So the 8 wounds they have is really more like 6 or even 5.
Right. So
yeah.
The other thing is that they have a gun that is very long range, which can kind of keep them safe, but it's a stat 5 gun with not great triggers that doesn't ignore anything. Doesn't ignore concealment, cover, friendly fire, anything. So, like, these guys, again, if the dream is that they go frantic and then they do a bunch of damage, but, like, it's so rare that your opponent will damage them enough to make them frantic and not just kill them, and that your ability to inflict your damage on yourself is fairly constrained. And if your opponent notices that, like, oh, these guys are getting close to frantic, he'll be able to turn it on. They could just kill them, and you helped.
Yeah,
like this thing. Yeah. They really, like, what I would really like to see for them is, first of all, hard to kill. Which would be helpful. And second, give them Stampede. If they had Stampede, I would probably take them because, first of all, they would. It's an extra way of pinging yourself a little bit of extra damage, to get to that, that all important frantic cutoff.
Yeah.
But also, they have Frenzied Charge, which is kind of a weird rule on them because they have a 0-inch engage and no special ability to disengage, and the way Bowled Over works in their melee, you can't use it's very difficult to use Bowled Over to disengage from a model that doesn't have a 0-inch engage. Like, if they have a 0-inch
in practice, it's a little easier now since they've they've given you a lot more flexibility with Torden Away. Like, it used to be that you could, like, never do it. Now you can, as long as there's some
they need to have a
0-inch
engage,
but
or if there's terrain in the way, they need to have, and it's challenging. So, like, if they lost Frenzied Charge and got Stampede, and got Hard to Kill, I would try them. As it stands, they're too fragile. They will die very easily, and at 7 stones, you are unfortunately forced to care if they die because that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I used to, at the beginning of 3rd edition, do exactly what Sam was saying, where I would frequently run lists with 2 or sometimes even 3 of these, because there just wasn't that much else out there that could threaten them, especially on the flanks. And they could just machine gun their way through stuff in melee, not with their crummy gun. And they can kind of still do that, but there's just so much more that can punch them down before they get the opportunity to, that I hire them a lot less than I used to. I would actually even go so far as to move these down to another category, the situational hires. If I take them now, most of the time when I hire them, I'm never even taking an attack with them. I'm using them because they're move 7 with Reckless. I took them a couple of times at Nova this year, and I think the 2 games that I took a Rooster Rider, I didn't end up doing any attacks at all either game. I used them to score breakthrough. I used them to score spread them out. They filled some of the other gaps that the keyword has, because aside from roosters, there's really not that much that you can take in this keyword that's fast enough to score some of those schemes. And when there just weren't other good schemes in the pool for me, my default was take a rooster, use them to score 2 or 3 points, and they've paid for themselves. If they get a chance to punch, great. If not, well, they're still scoring me points, so it's not the worst thing in the world. That's where I'm at with roosters now.
There's very little in the game that's just faster than roosters, full stop. They're speed 7 3 IP models, so I can see a GG in which they're good. Like, I don't think that this model is, like, ontologically bad. So I'm gonna take another look at that when GG4 comes out, and maybe my opinion will change.
I think that if we see something like my favorite strategy ever in the entire game, hint hint, wink wink, nudge nudge, weird, let's put it back in some form or fashion, plant explosives, these guys gain so much more stock because they are bananas at doing stuff like that, where I just need to dive bomb them as far as I can into my opponent's back corner and drop strategy markers and scheme markers so that I can score multiple points with this 1 7-point model that my opponent can't catch. That's when they really shine. In terms of combat ability, they are outshined by just about everything else in the keyword, and I don't need a Rooster Rider in melee in the center of the table because it will die that very same turn. I need it to just do other jobs. So that's where I stand with them.
Yep, about
Cool.
right.
So next up, we have a couple of the situational hires. I would consider Sparks and the Rockhopper to firmly be in this category. Sparks has a whole lot of text on his card, and he's seen some erratas and changes over time to make him better in some ways, worse in some others. Why don't you tell us what your opinion on Sparks is, Sam?
So Sparks is a model that I think it's sometimes is the correct way of putting it, because Sparks is a model you don't just like hire usually. Um, you can, and I'll explain why, but usually you're using him as kind of part of a module where it's
Yeah.
like Sparks, Survivors, maybe even the Mech Chop. And it's a pretty cool module. There's a lot of interesting stuff it does. Handing out Shielded is a way to make this crew a lot more durable.
Yeah.
Shielded to models that are already armored is very, very strong. The trigger on that, even though it's not the extremely broken launch trigger, is still a very, very, very good trigger. Here's an entertaining thing to do, by the way. If you are playing against Neverborn, specifically Nekema, and you hire Sparks, you can just stack Shielded on a model. You put 2 Shielded on that model from Mah, and then you put, Shielded from Sparks' ability. You can do that twice, right? It's not once per target per activation.
Yep.
So you basically, so for those who don't know, Sparks just has a trigger called Pack with Explosives, which is non-leader only, and it is until the end phase. After, well, first of all, it's on the ability Now You're a Robot, which is it gives the target shielded, and you may choose if you want to discard a scrap marker within 3 inches of the target, and if you do, it makes the target a construct, and also means that you can build in the Pack with Explosives trigger. So Pack with Explosives is really, it's whenever the target's shielded condition is reduced, enemy models within pulse 2 of it suffer 1 damage. It's like super black blood for your shield only. Yeah. So what you do is you do activate Mah, and you give 2 shielded to a model, like a test subject.
You want to do it to a test subject.
Sure. And then you shield the test subject with shielded +2 from Now You're a Robot, and then you shield the test subject with shielded +2 from Now You're a Robot. And like, if you really are a complete sicko, you could auto keyword a Banjonista for more shielded, although that seems like really kind of way too cute. Yeah. And then you charge your test subject into a mature Nephilim or even to Nekema, and you go, charge you, Stampede, deal a point of damage to you, deal a point of damage to myself. That damage reduces my shielded. My shielded was reduced, which pings out a point of damage to you. That point of damage to you was caused by a trigger, so it triggers Black Blood. Yeah. So you Black Blood onto me, which reduces my shielded, which pings out another damage to you, which triggers Black Blood again. And the net result of that is that if you have 6 shielded on a model, which is pretty trivial to get, with, as we just discussed, you charge Nekema and you deal 7 points of damage without flipping a single card.
Yep.
It's really, really good.
Now, the only downside to that is you do have to be careful that Nekema isn't also within Black Blood range of a bunch of your other models, because then she's dealing all that damage to them as well. But if she's isolated in an area, like she's killed her target, or
also the threat range on that is really long, because you can command Construct with Sparks to move somebody forward, and then they walk charge.
Yeah, you can definitely do cutesy stuff. It's very, very funny. I've pulled it off like 2 times, and your opponent's face just drops. Because it's not even like they take 6 or 7 or 6 damage, I guess 7 because of the Stampede. They're taking pings of 1, so they can't even really use stones to reduce it, because they're always going to be reducing 1 at a time. Very, very, very funny. And
yeah, I mean, generally
another reason that test subjects are hilarious. You can do it with anything, but Stampede is really what turns it on.
Yeah, and generally you won't necessarily be doing this to Nekema herself.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to be near Nekema, but like young Nephilim have 7 health.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
You could just walk up and like blow up a young Nephilim. You can do it to you could do it to pretty much anything in the keywords. Anyways, Sparks, let's talk about him more generally. I will try to keep this somewhat brief. You are, like I said, he's a sometimes because you're hiring a module. The other time, though, that you would hire him is Hostile Work Environment is really strong. It's a 6-inch aura that says enemy models within aura 6 may not be targeted by the actions of other enemy models. And that sometimes some crews are trying to target each other a lot, and this just turns it off, which completely makes the crew non-functional.
And he's unique in some ways. There's not a lot of Hostile Work Environment models out there.
There's 2.
There's him
and Anna.
I think Anya 1 has it too, right?
Oh, right. There's 3. There's
There's
him,
3.
Anya 1,
So,
and
like,
Anna
Anya 1
Lovelace.
and Anna are, I mean, Anya 1's not super durable, but she's more durable than Sparks is. Anna is very durable. Sparks is not very. So, like, you can hire him just for hostile work environment, but just bear in mind, he's a lot easier to kill than a lot of those other models would be. It's still a very, very, very significant ability, though, and something that can totally screw some opponents' crews.
Yep. So the other stuff that Sparks does, very briefly, is he makes pit traps into scrap markers, which turns on all the
Same
scrap
thing as
synergies.
Mah too. Yep.
Which means that you can hire the sort of construct module, and you can do things like ride the rails and magnetism using pit traps. And again, because of Bushwhackers and Mah's ability to put pit traps literally anywhere on the board at the start, you can have that sort of terminal of your ride the rails thing, your ride the rails movement, just immediately out there at the start of the game. So you get a ton of mobility, which is very strong. We love mobility in this game. So that is the other big thing he does. And then finally he has Command Construct as a bonus, which is a usable bonus, but it has a very high TN. He needs a 9 to get it off. One other thing though, actually, I do need to mention. Sure. His melee attack, you may choose to not deal damage to a construct and instead heal it. So yeah, I will. I think most of my Sparks activations where I'm not doing pack with explosives, even the ones that I'm often going to be doing some healing as well. He is really essential because, as we've said, Mah 2 is very fragile. If your opponent has any way of ignoring the armor, and he can heal her, which is a very big deal. He can also give her shielded, and armor +2 and shielded is a lot better than armor +2. Because the number one way people get around armor is ping damage, or just volume of small attacks, because armor can't reduce damage to 0. And with Sparks, they don't have that option because they have shielded, and then you can heal people. But he is super fragile, which is what keeps him from being a regular hire. He's an 8-stone model whose only piece of defensive tech is Scamper, which means if your opponent has any gun worth anything, he is extremely screwed.
Big trouble.
He basically needs to hang out near the pork chop and in event Steam Aura and hope they don't have guns that ignore concealment. And even then, they'll just focus to get through him. So this is a model that will die all the time.
I would consider him to be important enough to playing Mah 2 that he's probably an auto hire. In Mah 1, I'm going to take him in some kind of weird corner case situations, but not very frequently. The benefit to playing him with Mah 2 is that she is a 50 mil size 4, and the guns thing, you can reasonably speak and just hide him behind Mah so that people can't see him. But still, you got to be careful with this guy. One cute thing with him, I will say, is that especially with Mah 2, where there's already a lot of construct synergies in that keyword, and she doesn't really deal as much damage as Mah 1, I frequently find myself reaching for an out of keyword beater model to supplement the way that the rest of the crew works. And he works extremely well with things like the Lucky Emissary and the Whiskey Golem, which I have hired out of keyword with Mah 2 on many occasions. That really helps plug some gaps in the keyword, and Sparks himself is absolutely fantastic with those models. So you got to take that into consideration too. But overall, I like him.
You know when I'll hire him with Mah 1 is when I've locked Mah 1 and my opponent has declared a keyword that pit traps don't function into. So if they've declared Urami, if they've declared Tormented, if they've declared Foundry, then I know off the bat that my plan A with pit traps and Soulstone Miners and Whackers is not going to work. So I flex into the construct package and I hire Sparks, the Rockhopper, the Mech Chop, and multiple survivors, and basically focus on playing kind of a durable, self-healing gun line that can also have great mobility at a moment's notice.
Definitely. That's definitely something that can be done. I mean, he's a cool model. He's fun to play. He doesn't see a ton of table time in Bayou anyway. So I think your opponent oftentimes just doesn't really know how he plays. So I mean, it's kind of a intangible, but it does give him a little bit of dark horse potential. Not that we're talking about Foundry right now, but I do consider him to be basically stapled to Mayfang 2's card. But that's a whole nother episode. So lastly, we have the Rockhopper. Rockhopper's the newest model in the keyword. Does a lot of similar stuff to Mah Tucket 2, has the same melee attack that Mah Tucket 2 has, 2/4/5, ignores armor, and opponents can't take resistance triggers. It has a Knock-Aside, which we've already said is fantastic. It does have a 2-inch engage with Scamper, much like Mah 2, which is, again, fantastic. Again, he does more to cover Mayfang's bases because he has a really unique ability. Rusted metal, scrap markers within a 4-inch aura can't be removed by enemy effects. Very important. He's got a couple other kind of cute things that he can do. He can generate soul stones, but he needs a suit that he can't build in for it, so you can't really rely on it. One really cool thing is that his bonus action, which does have to target a scrap marker, you see that a lot in Foundry and some of the Mah 2 stuff, is until end phase, friendly models within a 4-inch aura of the target reduce all damage from effects other than attack actions and hazardous to 0, which is a huge deal into some crews. That ability, while having a fairly small area of effect, really, really, really hurts some things like Urami and Nephilim. So like Black Blood doesn't work, Vengeance damage doesn't work. A few other things just straight up don't work. I believe that it also shuts down damage from like poison and burning, if my timing is correct. It's cool.
It doesn't. It's until the end phase, so it goes away at the end phase.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I misread that. So until the end phase. That's never come up for me, so like whatever. I'm not
actually clear. I'm not totally clear how it interacts with things like liver damage, because that's the liver damage is an attack action, but it says they suffer damage from poison.
It would they take no damage from that, but yeah, that I'm quite positive of because
liver damage. It's whatever it's
the
called.
Poison condition. Mm-hmm. So that wouldn't work. But yeah, anyway, that's a very corner case situation. Overall, pretty cool model. I can't think of many circumstances that I would hire it in Mah 1. In Mah 2, it's probably important enough to hire most of the time. The only other thing to consider with Mah 1 is this guy kind of falls into the same bucket as one of the kind of like honorary Tricksy keyword models, the mechanized pork chop, in that it is a 6 wound model that is 7 cost and has armor 2. Which actually means that it is not very survivable, especially because it has low stats. So you do have to be aware of the fact that while it has armor 2, it's actually pretty easy for your opponents to kill most of the time. The mech pork chop is in even a worse position because it has reckless that it wants to be using regularly. This guy's not going to deal damage to himself, but he's still killable.
Yeah. So I really like Rockhopper. My opinion of the Rockhopper has gone up every time I've used it. Like Rockhopper stonks are up with Sam. I understand all the downsides, and they're all there. I would hire him as a tech piece. He is specifically a good hire when his ability to shut down armor or defense triggers and your opponent's weird out of non-attack, non-hazardous damage sources like Vengeance. I've mentioned a few times how much trouble this keyword has with Urami, and his ability to shut down Vengeance is a very, very big deal. I think that I'm probably more of a Rockhopper apologist than most people. I call mine Rock Hoppington Esquire, or possibly Rock Hopulon. And I think that he's a model that you should try if you think you're going to run into any of the categories of things that he has countertech into. And it doesn't need to be all of them. Like if your opponent has any kind of significant non-attack, non-hazardous damage, or if they have armor, he's good. Because this keyword, as we've said, has a lot of min 2s and hates armor.
Yeah.
If the opponent is relying on defensive triggers, like he murders Colette. Holy cow. He is generally, in my opinion, a cool model that does a lot. It just you have to beware. Like he has the standard problem that armored enforcers have, which is that they have bad stats and low health. So if your opponent has irreducible damage or armor piercing, then he's in a lot of danger. And as we've said, those things are more common than they used to be, but they're not universal. Like not every crew has armor piercing and or irreducible damage, and you will generally know before your crew build if your opponent's crew is likely to have those things, and if they're not, I think Rockhopper is great.
Yeah. One thing I will say, and this is specific to the Nephilim example, now a major this is a balance complaint on my end, so sorry to the playtesters and Weird, but I'm going to complain about something for a minute. This is one of those models that is very, very difficult to declare into a couple of specific factions, regardless of what sort of synergy they're going to bring. If you're playing into Neverborn in general, there's a pretty good chance they're going to have the newly revamped Angel Eyes, which means they are going to have an armor piercing model that can hit for enough damage to put him down easily. So that's a pretty significant downside. But that said, lots of cool tech, really cool model. I should probably use it more than I do, and Sam's points are well put. So
Yeah, just don't hire into Guild or Neverborn, I'd say.
Yeah,
because they both. I mean, Neverborn are all every Neverborn list is gonna have Angel Eyes until she gets adjusted again, and Guild can take really easily. What's it? The Expert Marksman. They won't necessarily take Expert Marksman into Tricksy because it's not like you have a ton of armor, but if it's the kind of matchup where they like, for example, if it's a Hoffman matchup, which is exactly where you'd expect to see it, a good Hoffman player who sees that you've declared Tricksy will throw Expert Marksman onto Melissa Core, and then she'll just kill it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the Rock Hopper, or Rock Hoppington, as it were. The last keyword model that we have, he's the only one that I have put in the uglies, which means that like the situations that you'd use him are very, very narrow, or he's just overall like kind of weak. And I hate to say it, but Ruffles is that guy. Ruffles is the jockey that shares the Tricksy keyword. Pretty fast. I mean, he's like basically a Rooster Rider without Reckless. Move 7, 5/4, 7 wounds, scamper. Has all the other jockey stuff like ramming speed, trample, stampede, so on and so forth. His melee attack has the same damage track as the Rooster Riders, but he does not have the cool triggers that help the Rooster Rider deal damage. Instead, he has Pecking Order, which is cool because you can get a pass token, but if Ruffles is in melee, he's probably in trouble. His gun is not nearly as good as the Rooster Rider's gun, which is already kind of marginal. You can do some kind of cute stuff with it because you can use it as part of the base attack, regardless of whether or not it damages. You can still push enemy models around, which is cool. And he does have super scatter. So Crazed Chicken is like the scatter ability, but it's a bonus action. It's a 3-inch pulse, and you can push models in any direction instead of just away. So like there's some area control potential there, but the problem is that Ruffles dies to literally anything. He is the most fragile model in the keyword, and he's a big model, and people tend to shoot for him. So your mileage may vary, but he can be kind of tough to use. What do you think, Sam?
This model blows.
Yep, there we go. Don't have to talk about it anymore. I will say, in GG2, I did use him a lot in ley lines to great effect. Because he could be a late activation that just double walks in and then Crazed Chickens to knock people off of markers. And you can absolutely do that in GG3 as well, but he just kind of dies. Like, if anybody has a gun and they don't have something good to shoot at because Mah's engaged and all your bushwhackers are stealthed and your Rooster is too far away, hey, the only target is Ruffles, so he just dies.
I mean, if somebody wants more than 3 words from me on this model, here's like one sentence. It has all the downsides of a Rooster Rider, which I just discussed, except even more so, and none of the upsides.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, Ruffles. Love you to death. You're not going to hit the table too much in this keyword. So we do have a list of some notable versatile errata keywords. Most of these are things that we're going to have the same things to say in Tricksy as we would in other Bayou keywords. So we'll just go through it and call out specific things that help them synergize without really going into the cards. First one I have on here is Mechanized Pork Chop, which is technically a Foundry model. It is an honorary Tricksy model because Sparks made it. I don't think it actually has the Tricksy keyword.
It doesn't. That's so weird.
Yeah, it's really weird because the problem is that since it doesn't have the Tricksy keyword, it's tough to play in Mah 2 because she can't make it immune to pit traps, which is really aggravating. It's a 6 wound armor 2 model, 5/5 stat that also wants to be able to Reckless. So it's actually a significant, like, using Reckless on this model is a significant tax. Literally the only reasons to play this model, in my opinion, are because you can drop a scrap marker at the end of its activation in base contact with it, which is much more important for Mei Feng to turn on Ride the Rails. You can do some kind of cutesy stuff with Rage Machine and Swine Cursed, but like that's not this keyword, and it's not really that good anyway. And it has Vent Steam, which is like good because you can stack up Vent Steam with pit traps and do like the whole double hazardous source hell that you can do in some other keywords. But like he's tough to use, and just the fact that he doesn't have Tricksy makes him much more difficult to use in Mah 2, which is the spot that he should actually be filling. So, that said, I still take it often because there are some specific things he does. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about the mech pork chop, Sam?
Remember that Mah 2 does make him immune to pit traps within 6 inches.
Yeah.
Not 12.
Not only the pit traps that are created. Sorry. Only the ones that are considered pit traps from the Scrapyard Mine's ability, not all
Are you
pit traps.
sure about that?
Absolutely positive.
Okay, fair enough. Anyways, yeah, I mean, it's partially the pit trap thing. I don't even think that's the biggest problem with him in Mah 2. It's that 2 of her best crew supporting triggers are keyword locked, and he's not in the keyword.
Yeah.
He really should have the Tricksy keyword. It's kind
really
of
should.
bizarre to me that he doesn't. But
Yeah.
that said,
It's
I
easy
actually
to overlook too. Like you wouldn't think about it, and then all of a sudden you look and you're like, oh crap, none of my stuff works.
That said, I am actually positive on the mech chop. I wouldn't hire it outside of the sort of module that we've discussed, which is Sparks, the Rock Hopper, the mech chop, and at least 2 survivors. But first of all, the ability to generate pit traps that you can get your ride, or generate scrap markers that you can get your ride the rails to, is good. The fact that in Mah 2 he can generate pit traps by dropping scrap onto enemy models, so you can actually drop the scrap onto somebody immediately and get them in the pit trap immediately. That matters. Like, that's a really big deal, because most things that create pit traps can't, like, they create them, so can't be in base contact. Mech chop walks up, puts a scrap on you, and you're in a pit trap. Rage Machine is a really good rule. Like, yeah, the mech chop takes damage, but it's actually pretty easy to heal it. It can eat scrap markers or pit traps to heal, and often you will have pit traps in your backline that you created because it was a bonus action that you no longer need because the battles move beyond there. So I've never found that I have a problem giving it food for Tin Feast.
Yeah, and oftentimes if you're near the center, you're going to be near Sparks anyway, so you can help with healing it. You just have to be really careful about, like, what's the decision point when you decide to Reckless below 4 wounds, and that gets real dicey. You got to be careful.
If you really are the kind of person who wants to make Rooster Riders work, then I think this guy helps that because Rage Machine is good with Rooster Riders. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the way you would want it to. No, it does, because it's the model that makes the attack takes the damage. Yeah. So the Rooster Riders can go Reckless, putting them down to 1, and then make 3 attacks, each one taking a 1 irreducible damage, and the last one puts them down below, and then they're at Frantic, which is pretty sweet. However, as we've said, Rooster Riders are bad. I don't know. I think Vent Steam is also important in this crew because you're relying on models that, as we've previously discussed, are somewhat fragile in the form of Mah and Sparks. And this gives you... Vent Steam is a little bit of defensive tech.
Yeah.
It's also incidentally really good with Big Brain Bryn, because Bryn is, as we've said, he's Serene Countenance, and so if he's in a Vent Steam aura, then he's
the double negative, and then like it does combo up well with like Mah 2 and the what's it called, the Rock Hopper, because you've got the big 2-inch engages, so you've got friendly fire, plus you've got concealment. Like there's some value there for sure.
Yeah, I'd say the mech chop is fine if you really want to play like Mecha Mah, and I don't think, not even Mecha Mima, that's the title, but like a version of Mah that is construct heavy, which I think is a totally respectable list, even if it's not the best way to play her. But you just need to be aware that it is fragile. Armor 2 is not as good defensive tech as it looks.
No. I mean, the other nice thing is that, if you do accomplish what you need to in the center, it does still give you a, move 6 model with Reckless, so you can pretty reliably go off and score some points on the flanks. It's not terrible. You just have to be really careful with it.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a floor on how bad a model with Reckless can be. Also, remember that this, again, despite not having the pig keyword, it has the pig nega trait of mandatory triggers and 0-inch engage, which in combination is kind of suck. But if you can get around that, this thing's melee is totally respectable.
Yeah, it's fine. Absolutely. So that's Mech Pork Chop. Next up on the docket, we probably don't have to say almost anything about this, but Bo Peep, I find, works very well with this, as it works with many other keywords. Mah Tucket 1 on turn 1 frequently doesn't really move a whole lot, so helping with the unpack and helping to spread models out outside of the deployment zone to make sure you can maximize her focus pulse is great. The healing is always wonderful. It's especially good If a bushwhacker does happen to get pinged by something and then manages to get back out of combat because you can, you're stealthed still, and it gives you the opportunity to get some additional heals while you're shooting from a pretty safe position. She does combo even a little better with Mah 2 because you've got Mah 2 with armor, and Bo Peep can use her Hogwash Slosh trigger on her melee to actually get Mah 2 up the board pretty significantly far. So pretty good synergies. I mean, I think that she's probably played a little bit more in Bayou than she really needs to be, but still a very strong model that brings some unique stuff to this keyword, especially because of how many ways she has to displace enemy models. Just being able to use Hogwash Slosh to pick up an enemy model and drop it into a pit trap is just as good as drop down a hole, but with a smaller area of influence. She's just a good model and works better with this keyword than many others. So there's my Bo Peep.
I actually have the opposite opinion of her. I think she... I like her. I think she works less well in Tricksy than in most other keywords, partially because you don't have a big cluster of models in your melee, in your deployment zone that you're trying to unpack, because your Soulstone Miners are digging, your Bushwhackers are already advanced deployed out. You've got, if you're playing the module with the constructs, you have ride the rails to get where you need to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, and also the healing thing is useful, but your models are very fragile, so it's not often that you're taking a bunch of chip damage, which is the kind of damage she can heal. That said, she's Bo Peep. She's great. If you are watching this, you know what she does.
Yeah, your points are well made. Like, the unpack has somewhat less value. The heal has somewhat less value because a lot of times if your model gets hit twice, it's dead anyway. So, or sometimes even once. But I will say the Hogwash Slosh has much more value in this keyword than it does in a lot of others, and it's already a very strong trigger.
Yes, I agree. I mean, she's Bo Peep. Like, she's good. You're never going to be sad because you put Bo Peep in your list. But this isn't like Whizbang or like Angler, where Bo Peep in the list is like a huge part of what makes the list work. It's just something that's nice to have if you have the room.
Yeah. The next thing I would say is there are many games where I really want to have some kind of a backup big beater model to pair up well with Mah, or to kind of cover some of the weaknesses of Mah 2. So I'll sometimes find myself bringing in another big model like a Mancha Roja, a Whiskey Golem, or a Lucky Emissary. They all have good synergies with the various versions of Mah. One of the benefits to Mancha is that he's already a pretty solid model. You do have some healing in the keyword. If you're taking Bryn, you can give him focus, which he doesn't really have access to otherwise. And there are some times that you can actually find yourself jammed in by your own pit traps, because it's really only Mah and the Bushwhackers for the most part that ignore them the majority of the time. Things like Tricksy Bell, Bo Peep, Big Brain Bryn, that kind of thing, they don't ignore them. And there have been times when I've gotten a little too crazy with putting pit traps out and found myself in a bad spot. Mancha, while not intended to remove your own pit traps, can kind of do it as like a bonus. You don't often want to be removing pit traps that are near enemy models, but it is a thing you can do if you have to. And this keyword puts out a lot of conditions. They can put out slow with both Tricksy Bell and with Bryn, which makes Mancha's Mutilate just a straight +1 damage, so he goes to 4, 5, 6. They can also, in addition to putting out slow, they can put out a lot of injured, which means that his finisher trigger is often going to make him min 5. Pretty strong. And because of the amount of card draw you have in this keyword, you usually have what you need to fuel his activations, because he is a very resource-intensive model. The other ones, Whiskey Golem and Lucky Emissary, those are a little more commonly taken in Mah 2 just because they have some strong synergies with Sparks. And they're just good models. It used to be the case that with Whiskey Golem, you could reliably take it in Mah because you just didn't really take armor models, so people wouldn't be able to plan for it. It's a little bit less reliable now because cagey or savvy opponents will be a little more likely to take incidental armor ignoring. So I think he's lost a little value versus where he was back in previous GGs or towards the beginning of 3E. But still pretty strong and something that I often take out of keyword. But what do you think, not specifically about each one of those, but about taking something like that to supplement Mah?
Yeah, I mean, Mah supports out of keyword beaters very effectively because her focus pulse is keyword agnostic. So you can just pulse focus onto somebody, and it's pretty easy to go Big Brain Bryn, sober up my out of keyword beater, Then activate Mah, walk up, horrible hollering up my out of keyword beater, creative cussin. I now have two focus stacked on my out of keyword beater, and I have also pushed them up 5 inches.
Yeah.
There's no model in the game that doesn't like that. So
Yeah.
like
I
I
mean,
think
a Mancha Roja with 2 focus that's in charge range and has a stacked hand with flurry, and you have conditions on you. It's bad, 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 bad news.
yeah, so I agree. I think that she does a very good job supporting out of keyword beaters. I really love Mancha Roja. I'm on record for this, but right now the out of keyword beater, if you're playing Bayou, is Auntie Mel.
Yeah.
She's
Again, yeah, she supports Auntie Mel very well.
she's
Also,
one stone
absolutely.
cheaper. Yeah, she's one stone cheaper than Mancha Roja, and her damage track is a little bit lower than Mancha Roja's, but she delivers the damage from a great deal of safety. Um, and she also just like if she needs to just point it, like she is one of the best models in the entire faction at just like picking an enemy model and being like, you.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and one of her biggest downsides usually is that she's only got the 10-inch range, but there's enough movement in this keyword to get her upfield so that she can threaten without having to spend any of her AP walking, which is a really big deal.
She also injures enemies by winning opposed duels rather than by pushing them into pit traps.
Yeah.
But if your opponent model is already injured, like holy hell.
Yeah.
Like
yeah, absolutely.
Auntie Mel, for those who have not run into her yet, she just like deletes things. That's
Yeah,
kind of her
fair.
thing. So this is, and the two things she needs are to be fed AP in the form of focus or I guess pushes up the field, and those are the two things this crew offers.
Yeah. She
Cards
also needs
and AP.
Yeah, and she needs cards and soul stones and AP, all of which this crew and focus, all of which this crew can give her. Very, very good. And then if you do happen to take any of the other angler out of keyword great models like Hermits or Uncle Bob, who we'll talk about in a minute, then she even gets to use her otherwise unusable action because you have another angler model in the crew. So that's pretty cool. So speaking of Uncle Bog, he is broken and Weird needs to fix him, but until they do, he's going to make it into many, 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 many of my Mah Tucket crews. Don't need to go on record with all the details on why he's so amazing, but he gives you a lot of mobility. He is extremely difficult to get. He's extremely difficult for your opponent to get off the table for a variety of reasons. There's heals, there's the natural musk, there's the other thing that he does is he actually enhances even further the abilities of the crew to thin out the deck and stack your hand because he's got off the path, which is a totally ridiculous ability on all models that it's on. And yeah, Bog is really good. So what do you got any thoughts on Bog?
I mean, I do not agree that Bog is broken. I think Bog is very good. I think he is as good as a 9-stone henchman should be. He's great, obviously, in this crew for many of the same reasons. Although, again, they don't really need as much card cycling as some other Bayou crews because you've got so much already, and they don't really have a strong beater who really wants to be off the path into position. So I think Tricksy gets a little bit less out of him than some other crews do.
In some sense, yeah. I mean, it gives you more ways that you can push Ma up the field, who is a strong beater that wants to get moved up. And he also feeds scheme markers for free to Bryn every turn with Weary Road, which is a big deal.
What I will say about Bog is that he's super, super durable. And as we've previously intimated, that is a weakness of this crew. So he patches one of this crew's weaknesses by just being this like frustrating, like fat sack of crap in the middle of the board that is very difficult to remove and does things that are frustrating.
Yeah, pretty good model.
Also, sometimes you can play like minionless lists with him and Bryn, and then you get a minion when you summon Richard, and so Bryn's ability turns on.
Yes, absolutely. So speaking of other aggravating little models that combo up well with and help cover weaknesses in the keyword, Bo Fishbacher's pretty darn good in this crew. So you know how when your opponent cheats cards and it lets you move, and you also have all these pit trap markers out that are all over the field and being aggravating for your opponent. Well, Bo Fishbacher also lets you move your opponent's model when they cheat. So now you can push your model and you can push your opponent's model. Plus, he has heals. He can make other miscellaneous non-hazardous markers into hazardous, so he can make things like the random scrap marker that you have down hazardous, or one of any number of other things. He's pretty darn good. There are some issues in his durability, but he kind of buffs the durability of some of the other models in the crew by healing, and he doesn't really require tons of resources because of all the EVS stuff that he has. So I like him a lot in this crew.
Yeah, so little personal news. Last year I had a very minor stroke, and it turned out that it had no impact whatsoever except it destroyed the part of my brain that remembers that Lost in the Bayou is a rule. So I actually typically don't hire Bo Fishbacher with Ma, and I'm not even joking. A literal part of that consideration is that I know that I'm going to forget to use his most powerful rule, because I always forget to use his most powerful rule, despite the fact that two of my favorite crews in the entire game are his two keywords, so I hire him constantly. So I mean, I can't really speak to how he works if you are remembering the rule, although I'm assuming well, because pushing people around in hazardous is very good. I will say that he is a healer, and healers have a rough time in crews that are very fragile because often things just die. But he does help keep Ma alive.
Yeah.
And that's important. So I can see it. I think that this is a sort of a situation where, like, if I'm hiring him, it's because I'm not hiring Tricksy Bell, probably. Because again, you also have a limited number of limited amount of real estate in your crew for models that don't deal damage. And Bo Fishbacher technically deals damage, but not reliably. And again, your opponent can control whether or not they want to cheat and get pushed into a pit trap. And maybe their activation will suck because they didn't cheat, but if you need to kill a model, Bo Fishbacher doesn't do that. So generally, I think there's two slots in the crew for models that don't deal damage, and one of them is Bryn's sort of permanent spot. So this is a model I would take instead of Sparks or Tricksy.
Yeah, and that's the trick. That's one very important point, and it's good that you brought it up. But if you fill a crew with primarily support models, you can't really do what you need to in many games. So it's tough to fit him in Tricksy. He pretty much always takes that Tricksy slot, and to your point, that same spot is the one that's usually reserved for Sparks. So like, it's kind of a choice of which one of those three models are going to make the most sense based on the needs of the encounter.
One of the advantages to Tricksy is that, unlike many crews, it can actually rely on its minions to deal damage, because the way it is doing things is stacking injured, which means the chief weakness of minions, which is bad stats and unwillingness to invest cards in them, is somewhat ameliorated. So I feel like I often feel like in my Tricksy crews, I'm hiring minions to deal damage and enforcers and henchmen to support and set up the kill, which is kind of backwards from how it normally is. But it also means that you do need a critical mass of minions that deal damage.
Yeah, absolutely. The other one specific model that I had called out, and I'll be honest, I haven't utilized him as much now as I have in the past, just because there are other very solid options out there. But that's my main man, Gluttony. I used to use him all the time. He was kind of like a faction all-star. He was the only thing in the game with maddening drums. He's probably one of the better ways to remove markers. And you don't necessarily want to be using him to remove pit traps, but if you do like a Mah Tucket triple bushwhacker list, like, you've most of the time got more pit traps than you're ever really going to need. So there's something to be said for a stat 6 model that can target something at 10 inches, displace it like 5 or 6 or whatever inches, and deal 5 damage to it and give it injured 1 at the cost of removing a few pit traps, like, and then do it again if he needs to. Like, I have had 12 damage activations with Gluttony before that completely take your opponent off by surprise. Again, not the most efficient thing, but I do like him. That's really all he does, though. Like, his entire card is maddening drums and a bunch of garbage abilities that never actually happen. So whether there's still value in that these days with such broad hiring pools, maybe not. We'll see.
I don't actually own Gluttony. I've never hired him into this crew, so I don't feel like I can speak intelligently to what it would be like if I did. I just looking at his card, though, and having seen him on the table, I just feel like I'd kind of rather take the stuff that we've already talked about. The stuff that has a little bit more of a proactive plan that is, not so much dependent on people's positioning.
The times that I have taken him I'm not taking him just so I can pick up pit traps and deal extra damage. I'm taking him because I need a good marker removal model that I can also use to deal a bunch of damage. So, like, if I'm playing into something like a Karis or a Riva, I mean, taking one of their models and picking up 2 pyromarkers, or a pyromarker and a pit trap so that you're dealing extra damage and injured, like, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's the use case. Is
Yeah,
you're
you
removing.
need to do 2 things with him, basically, is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm removing markers that my opponent really doesn't want me to remove, like really cares about me removing, then I'm probably feeling pretty good about him. If I'm not doing that, then I don't think he gets there.
Right. So the last one that I was going to say, and this is just kind of a fun thing, I have done it a couple of times, done a really goofy Mah 1 list that has 3 of the jockeys, Ruffles, Bo Peep, and Fluffernutter. Sorry to
Stumpy.
Stumpy, that's the one. Sorry, Stumpy, you still don't really make the cut. It's a fun thing that I've done sometimes as like a ringer, or if I'm not doing so well in a tournament and I just want to kind of have some fun. Mostly because while all of the jockeys are very fragile, they all interact with pit traps in one way or another, mostly by moving opponents' models or dropping pit traps underneath enemy models. Like, it's not great, but it's fun. It's just fun. It's so Bayou. Definitely not competitive, though. And I won't get into all the interactions because that'll take too long for something that isn't super relevant. But give it a try sometime.
Yeah, more power to you.
Yeah. So that wraps it up on all the models I was going to talk about. Were there any notable versatiles or out of keywords that you wanted to mention we have not yet?
So I mentioned Mel. I think that just beyond the ones we already mentioned, you're just looking for sort of generic, like, what are the good out of keyword hires for this pool, the situation. For example, like if you need take the hit, you got hermits.
Yep.
That's our take the hit model.
Yeah, hermits are a huge boon for this keyword, by the way. Oh boy.
Yeah, take the hit's very important. If so I think from here, like, what other out of keywords you hire, you're gonna know when it's the right situation, because it won't be Mah specific stuff. It'll be like, I am playing into Lord Cooper, I want to take hermits, or like, I am playing into like, again, we talked about I guess you mentioned the emissary already.
Mm-hmm.
I'm honestly trying to think. I'm like racking my brain a little bit here. I think that you've basically hit the nail on the head. Like, they, a lot of times, a lot of the out of keyword hires that people would used to like are things like Silurids that are like schemers, but Bushwhackers are really good schemers because you don't need to leap them up the board. They just start where they need to be. So,
Yeah.
this crew functions really well mostly in keyword, and I usually hire mostly in keyword, with the exception of an out of keyword beater of the the people we discussed.
One of the ones we already talked about.
And I'm going to try Bowfishbacher if I can get the surgery.
Yeah. The next thing was, I just wanted to briefly give a pass on second master potential. I don't really feel like Bayou in general has that much need for second master hires, with the honorable or with the exceptions of Zip One, who is, when used properly, an absolute terror as a second master into just about any keyword, but I think he functions even better in Mah, because she really likes the concealment that he can put out. Downside is you have to worry about that with your bushwhackers because they don't ignore it, but she really likes being covered by it. She also really likes him picking up enemy models with Up We Go and dropping them into pit traps, and he just does zip stuff, and zip is good, come to find out. So I know we've talked about that one before, but I don't often find myself reaching for a second master, just because one of the issues is that this keyword has so many low cost models that usually if you hire a second master, in other keywords, you're talking about taking them in place of a moderate to high cost henchman or enforcer, and then another average cost model. So you're really only down one activation. If you take a second master in a Tricksy keyword, 16 stones is enough for 3 models, plus some slop in some cases. So that makes the decision to take a second one a much more difficult one for me. The other consideration is that, Zoraida 1 is kind of the, or Zoraida 2 for that matter, but Zoraida 1 in particular is a very common second master hire. This keyword doesn't really have any high value targets for her to use her obeys on. Especially because you're not probably going to take Mah Tucket plus an out of keyword beater plus an out of keyword Zoraida, because you won't be able to use all the stuff that makes the keyword so strong. So that's my thoughts on her. And then for Wong 1, you can do some really goofy stuff with Wong 1 because like he doesn't really need his other keyword models to do work. He can use the glow ability to put out glowy tokens that don't actually matter on your own models and then just eat them for card draw, which is pretty cool. So it gives more card draw to the keyword, and he does really cute stuff with launch into space and pit traps, basically picking them up and multiplying them and dropping them underneath enemy models in the start phase before they even get to do anything, which is pretty gross. And then Wong 1 is just like kind of good overall. I like him. So those are my 3 second master considerations. Do I take them? No, not that often, but I see a use case for them. What do you think, Sam?
I don't really second master very much. I don't like it. I don't think it's busted. I just think it's not the way I enjoy playing. That said, Zip is the probably one of the best second masters in the game, and this is one of the better masters for him to second master into. So if you really want to second master, that's what you do. You do Zip. It's pretty straightforward. Wong, I agree with you that interspacing pit traps is good. I would not hire Wong as a master. I would just out of keyword a bushwhacker into a Wong crew.
Yeah, I mean,
is how I would do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think Wong actually has a lot to offer his crew, because he makes it very easy to stack glowy on them, and he benefits from the glowy you've already got stacked. So there's like reasons to want to hire whizbang models alongside Wong, and I just feel like I'd rather just play a Wong crew at that point. I don't think having Wong I don't think access to Wong's shockwave in another crew is like that big a deal.
I agree, especially where you can't target your own models like you can in a whizbang keyword, so it's just locked at TN 13, which is not terrible but not great, and like it's not phenomenal. It's just kind of fun. The only one of them that I think is a serious consideration is Zip 1, and I have done that a couple of times, but I also agree that like I just don't really do second master all that much. It's just not the way that I tend to enjoy playing the game, but that is a pretty strong combo.
Yeah, I also think that it's very dependent on the GG. There will be GGs where having a second master is very good, and there will be GGs where having a second master is kind of a liability because you don't have enough AP to do the stuff you need to be doing. So it's going to depend on the pool. That said, if you want a second master, just tire Zip. Like, don't think too hard about it.
Yeah. In terms of Mah as a second master, I don't think. I mean, I'm just going to be blunt. I don't think I would ever take Mah as a second master. She, Mah 1 is what I consider to be the better version in most cases. She does lose her leader only ability, which is one of the biggest draws to utilizing her. And she just turns into a very expensive second beater when I could just spend less stones and get something like Mancha that can deal equivalent or more damage. And she also loses out on all of the other defensive abilities that her crew kind of like layers to keep her on the board. I don't really see a super lot of reason to bring her. And then Mah 2, I mean, like, I guess maybe you could do it in some matchups, but she has so many keyword locked abilities that a bunch of the stuff on her card just doesn't work if you take her out of keyword. So,
yeah, I would not consider hiring either version of Mah as a second master. It just doesn't seem like a thing that's worth doing.
Yeah, totally agree. One of the last things that I'd like to do is just take a quick look at the newly teased models.
Oh yeah, we didn't even talk about those guys yet.
I know. So those being Jebediah and the Haberdashers. So let me pull those bad boys up. And all right, I had it pulled up already, but it closed, so I'm pulling it up again. All right. So, apparently I was busy looking at the aforementioned Vagrant Song Kickstarter thing, so I have to go back into the news feed to look at them now. Okay, so Jebediah and the Haberdashers. This is a new set of models that share keyword between Big Hat and Tricksy. There's a couple of things that are called out in the kind of editorializing around the cards. One of them in particular is that Jebediah does have a new version of Bio 2 card. And at this point, I mean, it was already kind of teased, but at this point, I would say it's pretty well confirmed that means that we're probably going to be seeing a significant rework on at least Summerteeth Jones himself and maybe even some other Big Hat models. Besides that, what we have with Jebediah is yet another model that fits into that 8-stone slot. He is a model that has armor 2. He has new Bio 2 card, which is during actions this model declared, it may cheat fate with the top card of its fate deck. If it does so, it must declare triggers if able. Most importantly, can't use it during your opponent's model's activations because it has to be during stuff that you are doing. And you can use it to cheat the damage flip, which also, what do you call it? Would happen after you've already declared triggers. So it allows you to kind of get around that restriction to a certain degree. We have, other than that, we've got another model that can drop pit traps. He has the same rule as Bushwhackers and Mah, where he can drop one at the start of the game and ignores them. He has Scamper, just like many others. He's got a Gatling gun. First Gatling gun in Bayou. 246 damage track, stat 6 defense. It does have Ricochet, which is a, kind of situationally good trigger and sometimes situationally bad, which kind of falls in with the whole big hat theme of negative triggers, and in this case, being forced to take them.
I think the number of situations in which it's a good trigger radically outnumbers.
Radically outweigh. Yeah. There's certainly
like, this is a good trigger. It's a good trigger that has occasional downsides. It's a good trigger, though.
It's a good trigger. He does not, unlike other models with pit traps, he does not actually have the create trap bonus action. Instead, he has Ride With Me. Very importantly, he is a size 2 model with Ride With Me. So there are a whole heck of a lot of models that he cannot target with that unless you put Ghillie Suit on him.
Most notably, Mah herself.
Most notably, Mah herself. So it's not as good as it looks for people. He's only size 2, and that's for balance reasons. He does have a Crow trigger, which he does not have a way to build in, where he can create a 50 mil pit trap marker within 2 inches of him. But it's yet another way that you can get them out. And since he ignores them, he can easily put it under him or in base contact with him without really having to worry about it. He also falls in with a lot of other Bayou models having marker removal. We're kind of like the marker removal faction. And here's yet another model that can do that. Once per turn with Scoot and Boot, he can target a marker, push him into base contact with it, then push it up to 3 inches. And if he hits the ram trigger, which again is not built in, then he can remove the marker and summon a Haberdasher, which is a little hat with mechanical legs and a gun, into base contact with it. So this guy, I mean, we can talk a little bit about the Haberdashers in a sec, but what are your kind of overall thoughts on Jebediah and how he fits into the Tricksy keyword, Sam?
I am very excited to take him. I think he's going to be an almost automatic hire in most of my crews. So the Haberdashers themselves, we'll get into, like you said, but I'm less enthused about them in Tricksy just because the way they are treated as scheme markers doesn't affect that many Tricksy things. It's basically just Bryn. Because they're not treated as scheme markers for schemes, they're only treated for the purposes of like abilities.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that's giving us a tell about what the theming of Big Hat is going to be.
Yeah.
It certainly works with Summer's title pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and importantly, a lot of the other models in Tricksy that do interact with pit trap markers specify scheme markers. Specify enemy scheme markers, which you would not be able to use on the Haberdashers. So
right. So that said, he first of all, I've sung the praises before of the Bushwhacker's ability to place a pit trap anywhere on the board. Having a pit trap that's like advanced and like on line of scrimmage is much better than just having one like randomly within 2 inches of your master.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big things with this crew, as we've said, the big gameplay loop is injured stacking, and another thing that we previously said is once you start getting injured, it becomes much easier to get more injured. So the natural sort of corollary to that is that the first injured is the hardest to inflict with this crew. Once you've got the first, subsequent ones come much easier. And however, this guy can inflict the first injured in a totally non-interactive way by pushing a pit trap marker over the enemy, which is something nobody else in the keyword can do, and which automatically catapults him, in my opinion, to auto-include status, because the easiest way to get that like if your opponent has like a beefy master like Von Schill with high defensive stats, the number one way to get the injured train rolling is to push a pit trap into him with this guy's ability, and like once you've done that, you can then start like really kind of letting loose. And as we've said also, and as we've sort of like broadly discussed, the main sort of play style of Tricksy is a gun line that is empowered by injured stacking, and this guy has a really good gun. Like it doesn't ignore things, so there's that. You need to use focus, but again, it's a crew that stacks focus pretty easily. And it's a gun that if your opponent is like, not in cover against, you're going to be doing some pretty beefy hits. So I really like that. I think that usually I will not summon that many haberdashers. I might do it if I happen to flip the right suit. Although I might even choose not to, because I might want the pit trap to remain where it is under my enemy's feet.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I think this guy is just, his job is going to. At first, I was like, oh, I'll just give him a ghillie suit, but then I was thinking there is actually a size 1 model that really doesn't want to walk. It's Bryn.
Yeah.
So this guy's just going to give Bryn a walk.
Yep. Absolutely.
He gives I think a lot of the time his turns are going to be like, give Bryn a walk, push up to a pit trap, and then push that pit trap onto an enemy, and then shoot the enemy you just pushed it onto.
Yep.
And I think he's just durable enough. Again, we've said armor 2 isn't super going to keep someone alive, but this guy's also not crazy expensive, and he has 8 health?
7
health?
7.
7 health is reasonable. Like, his defensive stats aren't good, but they could be worse.
Yeah, I mean he's fine. He does kind of have the same sort of issue of like the rock hopper and the what do you call it, mech pork chop, because he is the same stat line. 5-4 is the rock hopper. He's got the same number of wounds. He's 7 instead of 6. He's got the armor 2. So like you do have to be kind of careful with him, but you also don't really need to be close to your opponent with him, like the way that you do with the rock hopper. Basically everything the rock hopper does is within a small area of influence near enemy models. With him, like if you need to, you can theoretically just use him for ride with me, an extra pit trap at the beginning of the game, some incidental ones on the trigger with the ride with me, and then like shooting his Gatling gun. And if there's any pit traps kind of near the back of the table, like for instance the one that Mah puts down turn 1, just because she has to try and get some card draw, like that's a perfectly reasonable pit trap that's not going to have any other impact on the game to summon a haberdasher off of. So like why not, right? The cool thing with the haberdashers is, I mean, for one thing, they're a cost 3 model that is significant. Now, granted, they're only 3 wounds. They don't have stealth. They don't have armor. Like they're extremely easy for your opponent to kill. So if I expect any amount of ranged in the enemy crew, like I just don't take these. But like if you're playing into what is going to be a melee crew, I can see some pretty good reasons to consider just hiring 1 or 2 of them at the start of the game. Mostly because they have a gun. It's not a great gun, but again, you've got a lot of injured stacking, and they're a second gun that does have the potential to hit clever ruses. So that's a super strong trigger. I don't think that I would hire 2 or 3 of these as a matter of course. But in certain matchups, I can see bringing them in, and like for stuff like what do you call it? Carve a path. Like just having disposable significant AP on turn 1 isn't the worst thing in the world. Other than that, like they're not super amazing, but hey, guess what? They have more marker removal, scuttle, which now we have with hermits, we have with haberdashers. Like I can see a goofy list where I hire like 3 bushwhackers plus Jebediah plus 2 haberdashers, summon another haberdasher turn 1 with Jebediah, and then I have like a gazillion shots that I'm basically fishing for masks to hit clever ruses on. So I don't know if it's good, but it sure is goofy. And yeah, there you go. What do you think about these guys?
Well, you're fishing for pretty high masks because the stat is bad.
The stat's 4, but again, you're using them late when your opponent has injured, and the low stat is less of a concern.
I think haberdashers are going to be something I mostly just use in Big Hat, and I sort of like will instantly happen to summon one if I happen to hit the right suit and don't want to get rid of the marker here. I'm not super enthused about them. That could also change with the next GG because their ability to die and turn into a scheme marker is kind of cool. You can just put a scheme marker where you need it. But again, this crew has like draw out secrets. It has some reasonable ability to place scheme markers. So I don't know. I mean, I'm way more enthused about Jebediah than I am about the haberdashers.
Yeah, I like them both. I'm going to have to play with them to see if they end up fitting into my core crew, because again, it's that 8 stone slot. So like that's very valuable in this crew because it's the same one that things like Bo Fishbacher and Trixie Bell and Bo Peep and a couple other models all sort of fill, and you can't take all of them.
Yeah,
So
but you
it's
could take this
either
guy over a bushwhacker.
you can, yeah,
So I think that because that maybe frees, like, he's more expensive than a bushwhacker, but I mean that means I would be willing to play like a one bushwhacker list if I'm taking him, maybe.
I don't think I could ever in good conscience take a one bushwhacker list. But like I
That's
said, I
fair.
crutch on him really hard. So
One
yeah,
thing I'll say, just generally as a kind of a caution, is that as it currently stands, whether or not to take armor piercing into Mah is sort of a knife edge decision for a lot of people, that they may or may not do it. But once this guy drops, I think it's going to be pretty generally common
yeah,
to see armor piercing taken into
yeah.
Mah, so you need to be aware of that. And also, every Neverborn player is taking Angel Eyes right now because she's totally cracked. So
Yeah, this guy's like Angel Eyes
yeah,
bait.
this Angel Eyes bait.
He just dies. So
So I mean, you could take him into Neverborn. You just have to play extremely cagey with him.
yeah, I think that point where it's always taking armor piercing into Ma is always a choice, and with him being available, it's going to turn into a choice much more commonly than it isn't. We're probably
Yeah.
going to see even more of it into Trixie, which in some sense is actually going to make the non armor crews, like the kind of traditional Mah Tucket, like bushwhackers and maybe even rooster riders, gasp, more viable. But yeah,
And
anyway.
we have talked about Angel Eyes a couple times here, but what Angel Eyes really hates is range 14 guns with crit strike that are stealth, so she can't shoot them back. Bushwhackers kill Angel Eyes really fast.
I thought she was stealth as well. Isn't she stealth?
Is
Or
she?
is she just got?
No,
Or is she
she's
just
disguised. She's just disguised, and she's def 4. So like bushwhackers, even before she's injured, are plus stat against her, and it's not like she has armor. So yeah, you're attacking at plus stat with crit strike with 6 stone minions that you can have 3 of. Angel Eyes does not like bushwhackers at all.
So we've talked about this crew at great length. We've gone on quite a bit longer than I normally would. This is probably going to be the longest episode that we record.
Sorry, I'm
ever.
very verbose.
Yeah, we got 2 verbose people that played this crew a lot and have a lot of opinions on things.
It's a big keyword too.
It's a big keyword, yeah. So long story short, in terms of how they fit into the faction, when do you take Mah Tucket and why, Sam?
So she's my go-to on covert ops, because of the reasons I discussed. She's very good at denying it. Generally, I will take her. I think she can play any strat, which is a strength of hers. Carver Path is probably her weakest strat because it removes her markers, and it also requires her to kind of like run up the center of the table and not play cagey. So I don't like her as much on Carve, but I like her on Covert the most. I like Cursed Objects the second most because the crew is fragile, but it's possible to build it in a way where your relevant targets are kind of not anywhere close to being hit. It's very hard for opponents to pick them off, and you also have good snipers to kind of pick out their curse tokens. Um, Guard the Stash, I think she's fine at because she has access to pass tokens and displacing enemies, which are the 2 things that are good on guard, and she also tends to run high model count. But Guard the Stash does require you to kind of sit in a predictable place, which is something that Tricksy Cruise doesn't like. So what you really want to be doing with that is kind of using pit traps to bully the board. Like a lot of good guard crews are crews that have someone like a big beater, like a Mature Nephilim or a Mancharoha, who can bully people off of guard markers, and you don't have someone like that, so you would instead be using pit traps to have that role by basically like putting pit traps near the markers and having your opponent not want to go near them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's generally when I'd use her. I think I'm wary of seeing Assassinate because again it's usually 2 points against her, but she scores Load 'em Up very easily. She scores Secret Meetup very easily. She scores Breakthrough very easily. Sabotage, Leave Your Mark. I think she's reasonable at. So this is just a very flexible model. You could solo her through a tournament and not feel bad about it.
Yeah, there's very few situations when I would not take her. The kind of the normal thought process when I'm looking at a pool, and a lot of times this is going to come down to what the table looks like, and what the opponent's faction is. So you can't really just pregame and say I'm going to play mod every round of this tournament. But the first question I'll often find myself asking is why not Ma? If I can't come up with a very good reason why not to play her, oftentimes she's going to end up being the pick. I do think that there's some crossover between her and a couple other crews in the faction that can accomplish similar things in different ways. Like, I feel like the Tricksy keyword and the Angler keyword have a lot of crossover. Tricksy and Infamous have some crossover. But there are some things that Tricksy does that those others do not, which is like the super gun line, and making your opponent's life miserable with all the pit traps that a lot of times will catapult her into first place for me. To your point, Carve can be a little bit tricky for her, unless it's a game where I can send mine down the flanks, and then the only thing I have to worry about is my opponent picking them up in the center of the table. The benefit to that is that I find the majority of the time, most of the work that you're doing with the pit traps is happening during Mah Tucket's activation. And in most situations, there's a way for you to get down the pit trap that you're going to need to use during that activation by using her bonus action. It doesn't always work out that way, but it's not like Carve just totally obliterates all of her markers and then she's screwed like it does for some other crews. It's workable, it's just not ideal. So
yeah, I would say the sort of archetypical like nightmare bad pool for Ma is a wedge Carve pool with Assassinate and like Vendetta.
Yeah.
Although she's even reasonable at Vendetta.
She's
so
pretty good at Vendetta. Yeah, she's
like,
pretty good at it. Bushwhackers are pretty excellent at it.
A wedge Carve pool with Assassinate and Catch and Release, because she tends to run a lot of henchmen that don't do damage, and so it's very easy to score Catch and Release into her.
Yeah.
That's sort of like what I would consider to be the bad Ma pool. But, you know, that's a pretty specific pool. She's in general just very strong, has a wide variety of gameplay, and I don't think if I was only allowed to play one master for the entire rest of the edition in Bayou, it would probably be Ma.
Yeah. So speaking to some of your Danger Planet videos, if you had to give her a tier, both we'll just do a tier overall. So across the entire game, where does she sit?
Top of A, bottom of S.
I agree. I think that she doesn't have enough brutish strengths to just put her firmly in S, and it's easy enough to play her poorly.
This GG is actually kind of bad for her because it rewards all the things that she's not.
Right. So like this is probably the worst that she's been, and she's still really strong. Yeah. So yeah, I think top of A, bottom of S is exactly where I'd put her as well. Yeah. So that wraps up pretty much everything that we had planned on talking about. Do you have any other final parting thoughts or anything else you'd like to share with the good folks?
Well, I do have a bunch of like long kind of rambling anecdotes and stories that go nowhere if you have an hour or two. But other than that, no, this has been great. Thanks for having me on. I hope that the fact that we recorded this for like 4.5 hours does not turn you off having me on the podcast again. I hope that I promise I can be brief when I'm not talking about Mah Tucket.
Yeah, that's me too. So yeah, I mean, I think probably after editing, we're probably going to be coming in close to 4 hours, and I think the previous record was about 240. So yeah, I guess next time you come in, we're either going to have to make it a very quick one, or we're going to have to try and cross the 5-hour mark. So we'll just
I mean, look, I think I could knock out Infamous in a cool 2 hours.
Yeah, probably.
It's a cool keyword, but it's very slim.
It is. Cool. So with all that said, thank you very much for joining me, Sam. And to everybody out there, keep your conversations boring and stay weird, folks.